Alright, then I would like to welcome you back, and I'm happy to see you all again. So you heard yesterday the program, and it's kind of dense. Yesterday we stopped in the middle of the feature extraction. We could finish that, but I think it's better to start fresh and new, and maybe we want to do that if time allows at the end. So let's start with multimodal information fusion today. And again, what Alexei Karpov was choosing for you is to talk about different types of fusion that include sensor level, feature level, score level, and decision level fusion. So basically, sensor level would mean that you start fusion of different modalities, such as speech, video, or likes already at the signal level. So this could be, for example, in an end-to-end learning setting. You will look into those, and then you would actually start to really even align maybe on signal level, but definitely fuse on that level. That could include that you do common representation learning, which of course is very interesting because you would learn a common representation across different modalities. The more traditional ones I would want to say are feature, score, and decision level fusion. We'll see for those, but basically you either put in the features together from different modalities, so after extraction of features, or you make a decision for each modality, or you make a decision plus pseudo probabilities or probability scores, whatever per class, and then based on that do a fusion of those results. Now the second thing he was suggesting is talk about fusion algorithms. So he suggested based on rules. I mean, fusion based on rules is probably a short topic. It's basically crafting rule sets. There are some algorithms out there to learn rules, but we'll cut that rather short. He also was suggesting by support vector machines and neural networks, so we'll talk more about neural networks there. And just to remind you, the other one that we still have left is the classification algorithms. Now there he just suggested statistical learning and SVMs and deep learning. I would suggest, if you agree, but we can vote in the second slot today or as we go, that we swap order here, because to me it seems that neural networks are more of interest these days. So if you agree, we can have a vote then. We start with neural networks just to be safe that we cover the current hot stuff and keep statistical learning for as far as we can make it. Do you agree to this kind of proceeding, or is anybody particularly interested to finish first the feature slides off? If so, raise your hand, please. Okay, so let's go like that. So multiple sensors, multiple tasks to be solved with those. You could of course pick many different modalities and sensors. I chose just one example to illustrate the kind of problems you're having there these days. By what I'm doing in Augsburg, we're doing sensor fusion for healthcare in real life, so in an everyday setting with your smartwatch or something, you're fusing information to monitor health state. Now fusing information means from your smartphone, it means from your wrist, because you're putting together, for example, heart rate from the wrist with audio cord wherever, maybe at a microphone at your knee to monitor your joint health, put together with information from your smartphone, like social activity or like, for example, to measure health and depression risk. What comes as a challenge in such multi-sensor fusion is oftentimes that these days the producers of sensors change their hardware on a yearly or even monthly almost basis, because they're making most of the money by selling hardware. Not so much by running services on the internet or whatever around that. So if you think, for example, like we use these kind of smartwatches endowed with all sorts of sensors. They don't get money so much, they say, by running a web service that collects your data, analyzes it for you, but they really make money by selling you sensors. So ideally, we would want to be very flexible, because oftentimes with the sensors we don't know exactly what the pre-processing is, we can't turn it off. We don't even know exactly what the signal is, we can't access raw data easily oftentimes. And the life cycle of these things is very short. One of the major driving fields in multimodal interaction in particular is human-computer interaction. And just to look a little bit at the development there to get us motivated. So in the 70s, the vision was mostly, or the reality was that you have a screen, and maybe in the 80s, that was my first computing device. We basically had a keyboard and maybe a joystick. At the same time, in the movies we've already seen yesterday, the vision was already to have something speech controlled over those years. Later we had a mouse, appearing in broad scale, and handwriting interaction appearing in the noughties, and touch control and the likes. Most of the time, however, the interaction was still rather monomodal because you were using typing, so tactical and haptical interaction most of the time. In the movies, you've had still paradigms of interaction by haptical control, much prevailing, such as this controlling with your hands. Maybe that's partially video-based. But more recently, it really turned multimodal. If you think, for example, of interaction with a pen, the speech as interaction and the keyboard, so now we're more and more having a time where we really go on multimodal interaction. And we've also talked about Hurry a little bit yesterday, so in the future there's an expectancy of even more speech interaction in even richer ways, but probably mixed more and more with also gesture or other things such that the interaction becomes more and more natural. If you think of interaction with robots, HRI, probably it's going to be very much as we interact, maybe even enhanced by some other signals that humans don't have access to, like the heart rate or things like that. So coming back to an example from our domain, and that's the last one really, before we get going into algorithms and stuff. What we do as that is sense health state. So what we're looking at is neurobiology from sleep arousal systems, motor circuits, emotion circuits and the like, via the behavior of a person, sensed by many different sensors. So for example, we do depression monitoring in the wild to do burnout prevention or even suicide prevention. By getting all the information from the smartwatch and maybe some wearable devices like these hearables or alike, where you put together a microphone, accelerometer to get movement data, the camera maybe even to get facial expression or alike, EEG and many other things. Even the light sensors to see if you're moving outside or inside and if you're exposed to sunlight or not. So there's a lot of information to be fused. Major challenges include, of course, missing information, so not all sensors deliver at all time. It includes faulty information and dropouts, but it also includes fusion in terms of alignment of modalities. So because they may have temporal deviations by offsets, but even by tape speed variation, if you will. So yeah, dynamics changing from modality to modality. And at the end of the day, in HCI, you usually are interested in the intention of the user. We are more interested in the state in the setting, like sleepy, intoxicated, depressed, whatever that is. So what we use to communicate with the user is serious games, robots, virtual agents and interfaces, and of course also the interaction is very multimodal. Here, for example, this was a game to teach autistic children about emotion. You had body gestures, facial gestures and voice, so highly multimodal. Similarly with the robot and the virtual agent, the interface is maybe more conservative with touch and speech. And here is one example of this robot interaction and training of the robot interaction. So you have several webcams here, keyboards, microphones, Kinect for depth information, audio is being caught and the likes. So that's the idea, put together those different information streams, put them together in ways robust against missing information, faulty information and asynchronous information. And if you look at how trendy that is, you can see a clear increase if you look in the ACM digital library for the term multimodal. I think this drop here at the end is because we did this in 2015, so if we would do it now, you would get further increase. But you can see the term multimodal appears increasingly often in the literature. And despite the fact that when I was hired as a PhD student, my topic was multimodal error robust HCI. So already in 2000, people were thinking now is a big moment for multimodal, but it seems that it's still increasing in relevance. There's different types of multimodality in the sense that modalities could be redundant or non-redundant and could be separate or multimodal signals. So are they complementary in the sense that they are fully redundant and they carry the same information, or are they complementary in the sense that they are carrying additional information? Like the classic one would be the put that there example. So I'm speaking what you should do, put that, and I'm pointing it there. So this is really complementary. Multimodality, fully redundant multimodality would be audiovisual speech recognition, where you see the lip movements and hear the sound, and you really have full redundancy. Today, in this talk, we are mostly looking into the redundant, fully redundant type of fusion, rather than the complementary one, where we have this addition of information, but we'll have a little bit on that too. So now these different types of fusion, and for that let us go back to looking at the chain of processing in pattern recognition. So usually in pattern recognition you would have, oh that's really hard to read on this view, I'm afraid. So we're going from signal capture over pre-processing. We've seen that in the example yesterday where we enhanced singing and deleted the music, for example. Then we have the feature extraction on frame level, segmentation, higher level feature information extraction, maybe some vector quantization, and then reduction of the feature space. So this is all the pre-processing and feature extraction front end. And then we go into the back end where we do optimization and learning and the likes, and maybe even some confidence estimation, unsupervised, weakly supervised, whatever learning. The point is, we have different stages here where we could integrate features from another modality. So for example, here we could inject features on feature level from another sensor. This could be on the frame level, it could be on the functional level, it could be on the level of vector quantization. Vector quantization, as we will see, usually the easiest one, because once we only have a histogram, it doesn't have time information anymore and it's easy to fuse. Or it could be much later here at decision level, such that we already made a decision with some classifier and then did some confidence estimation potentially and include decisions from another modality. Now based on whether you would do this confidence estimation or not, you would call it a score level decision kind of fusion, because you integrate probabilities for all the target classes. Or if you omit this step and you just make a decision for one class out of n per modality, then it would be an actual decision level fusion. Now in the future we want this more and more to go into such a simplified model. This could be a recognition engine for whatever, like for example for yesterday's speech emotion, but it could be anything else. And here you could have multimodal data and models trained in one coherent path by end-to-end learning, rather than having all these different later moments in time. You would usually go there for signal level fusion. Now here are some use cases where multimodal information is used, speech recognition and synthesis, for example, like in audiovisual speech recognition. So reading lips and hearing the information. At the same time, speech synthesis in the future is more and more multimodal, because you're also moving lips of an agent or of a robot or whatever. Then you have event detection, like action recognition, for example in terrorism, threat recognition. There were quite some challenges held in the community where you recognize people doing whatever suspicious behavior, but also hearing sounds. Multimedia event detection, of course, in effective computing, it's a big topic, putting together facial expression and the voice, for example. Media description, we'll see some examples of image description and video description. Also summarization and question answering and multimedia retrieval. So you see also some of the problems and challenges here. That's representation, fusion, alignment mostly. So alignment, if they are asynchronous, the information streams, but also co-learning. So once systems learn more and more weakly supervised, you're also using multimodal information to do semi-supervised learning, for example, active learning, benefiting from the different modalities. We'll also see for that. Now, to the classics first, early, late, and intermediate fusion. The early fusion, it says, where you have the features coming from each modality. You fuse them in, for example, a shared hidden layer or whatever else to be put together into a support vector machine or something alike, and then make a decision based on the common feature space. That would be your case of late fusion, because you would basically have each feature vector classified individually. So you're having a result for your modality or sensor A, B, and C individually before, then you make a decision based on those. That could be, for example, majority voting. So just saying, okay, speech and video say it's class A, but heart rate says it's class B, so let's go for class A. Now, of course, you could do that in smarter ways. You could learn a confidence or trust in each modality, so you could weight each modality with a trust and make a weighted sum, rather, or weighted majority vote. But you could also go for something where you extract features and then do some smarter intermediate kind of fusion. For example, rather late is when you do some pre-decisions but keep your scores as set. Some earlier would be that you extract individual features uncoupled from each other and then make another shared layer in your network, for example. So if you're looking at this from a neural network point of view, for example, you would have your early fusion here by having the features from modality 1 and 2 and then have fused layers throughout until you have a final decision layer or classifier. Your intermediate fusion would that you have some layers per modality potentially individually at first, and then later on have some fused layers before you make a decision. And then finally, the late fusion is really again where you have all your processing per modality separate, including the decision making, and then including the final decision being made on pre-decisions per modality. So pardon here the affect classifier, just consider it could be any kind of classifier. This again is feature level, so you have all the features put together, or you have pre-decisions per modality for late fusion. And one thing I wanted to illustrate here is that you could also mix the two. That's the hybrid fusion. That's not intermediate, but it's rather combining early and late, for example. So consider for that you're having features from modality 1 and features from modality 2. You can feed each of these feature sets into an individual classifier, make a decision and make a late fusion here. So this path here is late fusion, but you can also still fuse the features, do an early fusion and integrate that as a sort of third opinion into your late fusion. So that is different insofar as you really have a mix of early and late fusion, and of course you could think also of mixing early, late and intermediate fusion. Now you might ask, what does that give me? Is it all heuristics? Oftentimes, unfortunately, it really is. So it's not too clear. Often in papers it's just trial and error, whether it's better to do early, late. But there is a lot of considerations around that. And one is, for example, the fail-safeness. So if you think of the feature fusion, what happens if a modality drops? So for example, if speech is not present and I want to fuse for emotion recognition, speech and facial expression, let's assume the person is not talking at the moment, you're missing these features. Is your classifier able to deal with missing feature information? If not, it's easier to go for late fusion, because in late fusion you simply have one classifier missing, the second classifier having a decision, and then at the fusion stage you're simply missing one vote and the majority vote. That's often easier to handle. So in other words, late fusion can be more fail-safe, whereas early fusion integrates all information already early on, and ideally on signal level, if it's coupled there already, you can learn dependencies between the signals. So usually you would expect to have early fusion give you better performance, but late fusion having practical advantages, for example, fail-safeness. And then the hybrid fusion could be one of these approaches where you try to combine these ideas by having this early fusion here as another vote, maybe a powerful vote. Maybe if you have a weight decision here, you can learn that powerful vote. But if one modality is missing, you're still going with the votes from the individual other classifiers. Now similarly, you could distinguish on representation level between joint representation, where you have the information projected to the same space. So here you have your joint representation from unimodal features, for example, and optional intermediate processing. But you use all of the modalities as input. As opposed to that, you have coordinated representation existing in their own space, but coordinated through a similarity, for example, Euclidean distance. So here you have your coordinated representation as opposed to the joint representation. So they are individual in terms of representation, but could still have some similarity. Now another issue in multimodal interaction or multisensorial fusion is often the data. Do we have enough data collected that always has both modalities present or not? So you can say we have different types of data. The fully parallel one here is where you have modalities from the same set and direct correspondence between instances. So let's say each data point here has speech and video inside, and they also correspond. That would be the case for audio-visual speech recognition, for example. Then you have non-parallel, where you have modalities from different data sets with non-overlapping instances, but overall overlap in general categories and concepts. So meaning that you have a speech-emotion database that only contains speech and emotion labels. You have a facial expression database that is only facial expressions and emotion categories, but at least they have the same categories, and you can train a speech-emotion recognizer, a facial expression emotion recognizer, and then put it together into a multimodal one. Obviously, the fully parallel is much more preferable for training because you have the two modalities come from the same database and you can learn them together. But obviously you will have much more data available for this kind of setting because most databases in reality are monomodal, and you can use monomodal databases here to train each classifier for late fusion and then do a late fusion and still reach multimodality. Now hybrid, that's the last one here, could be instances or concepts being bridged by a third modality or data set, meaning let's say you have a data set A with speech only and a data set B with vision only, but both also have physiology inside. So physiology would then be your bridging item here, or they simply have some overlap in parts of the data such that you can learn from that. Now fusion by deep neural networks offers also some kind of transfer learning. We will see some transfer learning examples in more detail later on. But it could mean, for example, that you pre-train network parts by recognize things, for example, in images, and to recognize things in audio. And then you put together these pre-trained parts into a final network to train the multimodal recognition. So there's a lot of potential in doing pre-training in neural networks to get multimodal fusion solved in new ways. My colleague Maya Pantic at Imperial was also doing an interesting variant of fusion by doing fusion by prediction. So she basically tried to predict one modality from the other within neural networks. So for example, the lip position from the audio and the audio from the lip position to do audio-visual speech recognition. And then she would see for how well it fits the reality. So you have a video, you have the prediction of video from audio and vice versa. And that way around get an estimate what is the reality based on a sort of generative approach by generation. Now if it comes to timing, a particularly easy way I said is using back of words. So back of words or histograms basically means that you do some unsupervised clustering per modality. So for example, you do clustering of audio to assign audio instances to some audio dictionary entries from vector quantization, and then you do a histogram of occurrences, so how often do these audio words appear. You can do the same for video, for example, so you do some unsupervised clustering and then count in a histogram appearances of these video words, so back of audio words and back of video words, basically fused by histograms. And with histograms, of course, you eliminate all the temporal dependencies, so you can't do this in audiovisual speech recognition, but you can do it, for example, in audiovisual emotion recognition, and that way get rid of the problems such as audio operating on 100 Hz, in terms of frame rate, and video, for example, operating potentially at 25 Hz. Or even worse, if you want to put this together with actual spoken content, maybe it's operating on 1 Hz or below. So, in other words, the problem that each modality potentially operates on a completely different time scales can be circumvented for feature-level fusion by just using histograms if you don't need time information. Who of you knows k-means? most if not all, so let's not talk about it really. That's unsupervised clustering. So basically the idea is that we simply find in the feature space these clusters, and for the histogram calculation you would do one round of k-means or even several iterations of k-means to find your dictionary entries, and the dictionary entries would be the mean vector or one vector out of this cluster, and the k will be the size of your dictionary. So for example, you say you want 1024 entries in your dictionary, then you do 1024 means, you get your dictionary entries, and the next observations are assigned to those means, and then you do the histogram calculation. So, as I didn't ask as we went yesterday, are there any questions at this point? And please really be invited to raise your hand if you have any. None? So let's move on to multimodal fusion algorithms. As I said, I don't want to really talk about rule-based much. Rule-based could be very simple, like for example event-based fusion. So we've been talking about feature-level fusion, where you put the features together and add them for classification, or decision-level fusion, where you make pre-decisions before you add the information. Event-based could be a special case, for example, where you have different modalities recognized, for example, laughter, smiles, or whatever, maybe from audio, maybe from video, as events. And you have partial overlap of these here. And in the end, you want to recognize something like, say, enjoyment based on laughter and smile events. If you do that, you could, for example, easily craft some rules, like if voiced laughter is present while smile is present, and so on and so forth, then it's enjoyment, but if unvoiced laughter is present, and so on and so forth. Of course, you could do this also in a histogram representation, and just translate this again to histogram across modalities, and then use your support vector machine or whatever else to make a decision. So in that sense, support vector machine fusion, there are some kernels that allow for information fusion, but that would take quite some special use cases to work well. More suited usually are dynamic Bayesian network or graphical model topologies and neural network topologies to do something from the architectural point of view. Here, for example, you have a dynamic Bayesian model to fuse two modalities and top-down features. So you're having the features of each modality, but you can also inject some top-down features. It could be, for example, priors, it could be contextual information or alike. And in general, with graphical models, you can craft also things like this coupled hidden Markov model for two modalities, where you have two state sequences fed by the features. So each feature observation has its individual state sequence in the coupled hidden Markov model, as if they were doing this with hidden Markov models only for one modality, but the coupling actually happens between the states of each individual modality. So in other words, if you have audio-visual speech recognition as an example, this would be your speech recognizer with audio only, hidden Markov model based. This would be your lip reader, hidden Markov model based only, and the fusion actually happens by coupling these states and allowing the information to influence each other, to influence the warping in each other path. Now, why is that important? Because in audio-visual speech recognition, you have the asynchronity of lips movement and audio. For example, you're opening the mouth already, but then only articulate, or the other way around, you're already shutting the mouth, but you still hear something. So to compensate for these kinds of asynchronicities, each modality can warp at its own speed, but each other but they influence each other to reach a common informed warping across time. So there are more graphical model topologies for fusion, and I'll have them in the last talk if time allows, where we talk about graphical models. Who of you is using graphical models? Nobody. Who of you? But you all raised your hand almost yesterday for hidden Markov models, right? So who of you knows dynamic Bayesian networks? Okay, also very few. Dynamic Bayesian networks. Okay, so basically dynamic Bayesian networks and graphical models are an extension of hidden Markov models, and this really is a hidden Markov model, as said, for one modality and for one modality coupled by informing the state processing across these. Now coming to neural networks, sequence-to-sequence learning and autoencoders and encoder-decoder architectures are pretty on vogue, you might want to say. So you could have an encoder recurrent neural network with modality A and a decoder recurrent neural network feeding into modality B, or similarly with an attention mechanism or masking in between. So you have your encoder input sequence and encoder states, your decoder input sequence and decoder outputs with some attention mechanism between the encoded states and decoder outputs. Now here are some examples along those lines, putting together, for example, a CNN encoder followed by a recurrent neural network decoder to put together something that can handle images. That's the CNN part. And here, pardon the typo, this should be LSTM and not LTSM. The RNN part for textual descriptions. So you're basically mapping your image observations to a sequence of words. Like here, a stop sign is flying in blue skies. It's very hard to see this, but basically it's a mistake because it's an air balloon in the sky and it mistakes the air balloon for a stop sign. Or here, a herd of elephants flying in blue skies is actually penguins, so you see, of course, this makes some mistakes. But the idea is that you have the CNN part recognize image regions and then to generate text from that by training this with pairs, of course, of images and according textual description. So that basically is heavily used in neural machine translation, so machine translation with neural networks, and NMT has more or less pushed aside the old school AMT, automatic machine translation methods, which were largely done with statistics. I was recently at a machine translation conference, and the consensus of all of those speaking actually really was that NMT is the thing at the moment being. Here you see an example of a French sentence translated to English and the attention learned from that. And what you can see is that most of this happens along the main diagonal in terms of attention, because the word order remains the same and it's a one-to-one correspondence. So here it says l'accord sur la zone économique européenne a été signé en août 1992, and at the same time the agreement on the European economic areas was signed in August 1992. So here the article le and the are at the same position, accord is agreement, sur is on, la is the, and so on and so forth. So it learns the attention to map or to do the alignment, basically, or the correspondence of each position with each other position. But then you can see the spread here in this area here, and that is where the French is usually using the inverted word order. So you know, the French often do things in the opposite order than in English. So for example, the United Nations organization in French would be ONU, the Organisation des Nations Unies, or something like that. So you have the attention here spread up because Zone économique européenne is European economic area, and you see the word order is swapped in English versus French. So you have exactly the attention here learning to see this potential difference in word order. Now you can see in this attention mask, not here because it's too bright, but here there's some other things here which are outside of the main diagonal, meaning this has been trained on several sentences with this kind of length and in this kind of context, and therefore learns to do that. Now similarly, you can do this with topologies like the ones I've been showing before, so encoder-decoder architectures potentially mixing CNNs for the image part and LSTM RNNs for the textual part, and then introduce the attention mechanism just like here to learn attention between word correspondences and images. Again, sorry, but you can hardly see it here, and I don't know if you can see it here. But here a little girl sitting on a bed with a teddy bear, and you can see that the word girl here, similar to this kind of attention mechanism here, finds the attention here around the face of the girl. a group of people sitting on a boat in the water. The people here find the attention mask in the image where the people are, and so on and so forth. So it's basically learning these image word correspondences, and from that learns these kinds of description. Just some more examples of that. So you have here image regions and textual descriptions, and you learn a scoring function between them. So again, you have a recurrent convolutional neural network here for the image regions. In this case, a dog with some frisbee. And then you have the dog leaps to catch frisbee textual description given by users on the internet. So you have those millions available to train this with. And then again, you learn these attention masks between image regions. So here you can see the image regions found where objects are identified. And from the output of the neural network, you learn these correspondences. And finally, for a whole image, the same kind of idea where you have a CNN again for the image part, and have an accumulated matching score here for the beak is yellow and pointed to give you this description. Now that is of course a special case, text and image. It's also a particularly challenging one because you have symbolic and non-symbolic. You can do the same in principle with audio to video, for example. MIT was doing a paper, for example, where they learned sound recognition with exactly such an approach. Rather than having textual output here, they were mapping between video recognition and sound input to get to learn about sound events. So the idea is that they have CNNs pre-trained with millions of images to recognize objects well, and then they have the computer literally watch YouTube or whatever for hours and hours and hours to hear sound while it's seeing images to get the correspondence between how a car or whatever sounds. Now, one particular algorithm I picked for you is what we recently published in TPAMI on dynamical time warping enhanced by deep learning. So dynamical time warping, who knows dynamical time warping? Not all. Okay, so maybe it's worth later on showing it, but the idea is that you have different events in time correspond to different other moments in time from the sequence A and B. So dynamic time warping was heavily used in the context of speech recognition in the whatever 60s, 70s, later on for speech or dial on your smartphone when you spoke the name 3 times and it could re-recognize that name because you sometimes speak slowly and sometimes not so slowly, and then you have to map where the O's appear in the time to other moments in the other word where the O's appear. So similarly, I mentioned the example of audiovisual speech recognition. You could have the lips moving and showing different phonemes, for example, at different moments in times when your speech has them. So you need to do some mapping from some moments in time, from one modality to another moment in time. So for example, this could here be the lips, which are already shaping an O, but the sound is only audible here. So the different moments in time where you can hear an O would all, see an O would all be mapped to the one moment where you can hear an O. That's the time warping part. But in dynamic time warping, you're usually using something like Euclidean distance, and that doesn't allow you to go across modalities. Now here we want to map across modalities, so rather than using Euclidean distance, we're using CCA, concordance correlation, or whatever else, but something based on correlation, to do a correlation-based similarity measurement and map these moments to each other. So it's a correlation-based time warping. And to introduce to this temporal alignment some spatial transformation. We're not using some CCA directly, but rather have some deep neural networks here pre-trained for each of those modalities to allow, for example, to get attention masks or lights introduced. Now here is an example of doing this in comparison to other approaches like DTV or GTV or whatever variants of allowing of time warping. Here infusing heat cameras which are not synchronized with some RGB or black and white cameras, and you get the lowest alignment error by this kind of spatial temporal alignment in a united cost function. Here is another example of doing that for Within modality, smile synchronization, so you have neutral, offset, apex, onset, and neutral. And you're aligning sequence A to another sequence B such that it matches in time. And you can see the ground truth would be that they are always at the same moment in time aligned. And here the deep canonical time warping gives you more or less the ground truth, so what it should be like, a little bit different maybe at those moments, and then the other ones partially fall completely off. And what you learn with the network is that these kinds of attention masks, which again are hard to see because it's bright here, but you can see that it's looking at the eyes most of the time, sometimes at the lips if it's about audiovisual speech recognition, synchronization of misaligned audio and video. So you have a microphone, you have a camera, and they're not aligned, they're misaligned, and you bring it back together. Now we will see an example for that. I hope we have audio, and in this upper right corner you will see the deep canonical time warping. So the time warping was canonical relation analysis for allowing cross-modal similarity evaluation, and then also including the deep network to do the spatial temporal combined cost function. Here outside you will see concurrent algorithms. Actually the one up here is almost boring to watch because you will see perfectly aligned lip movement and speech, and outside you will see how bad this works if you're not using such a deep enhanced warping. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So here, despite the original sequence was misaligned in time and video, you saw the lips moving as you would expect, and let's watch it again and you can watch it other ones. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. And you can see that for the other ones it doesn't fit so well. So that is an important step to align the modalities in time, and then you can also do more reasonable feature level fusion or whatever other fusion. And you could do this in theory on signal level, on feature level, or somewhere in between. Or hybrid, of course, again, so using signal information and feature information in the fusion. So one thing you can do with neural networks to prevent failure in case of failing modalities is that you use dropout learning and drop out some modalities. Who is familiar with dropout learning? Okay, that's few. We will cover it later on. And the neural network part, the idea of dropout learning is that you leave some parts of the network out during iterations of training to have regions of the network become more self-dependent and less dependent on other regions in the network. So here the authors that won Charlearn behavior analysis challenge in 2014 were using such an approach where they had dropout simulated for different modalities at different moments in time. So here you can see modalities A, B, C, or information stream A, B, C, let's call them. And you can see at different moments in time during learning, they drop out modalities, randomly picking that and doing that repeatedly to have an overall deep neural network which is using the information from individual networks, such as convolutional parts of the network, to become more robust against such dropout of modalities. So here's their full network. They were looking at behavior, so they had a camera on the right hand, left hand, and a motion capture stream and an audio stream. You can see they used mean frequency histograms here and pose features, and here they use the image, all fed into CNNs somehow, and then all fused with shared hidden layers to come up with an overall multimodal estimate of behavior. But in between, they do this dropout learning to train the network to also do something reasonable in case that modalities are missing. So that is an interesting example of also with neural networks, and not only in late decision fusion, you can train something that is robust against missing information in some of the channels simply by doing dropout learning, and then if the modality fails, the network doesn't break down, but rather than that, it learns weights per modality and also for modalities across each other in case some modality should be missing. So now I wanted to talk a little bit about things around multimodal processing, and this is first of all talking about multi-target. So often you not only have multiple sensors, but you also have multiple targets, and in such case you're shaping a neural network to have output layer which has nodes for each target task. So this could be, for example, recognizing a speaker's age, gender, emotion, personality profile in one neural network to get you a better understanding of the overall person, even if you're interested only in one task of all these. The other ones could be supplementary tasks. And if you do that, you could shape a network similarly to the dropout learning per modality, not only from bottom to top, but also from side to side, to learn different target tasks in a pre-trained way, one by one. Now, if you add different modalities to this, it could look like this. You have modality video, audio, and physiology. This is from a recent science robotics articles where we do child-robot interaction. And at the same time, we're having several target outputs like culture, gender, and individual information to, at the end of the day, recognize the emotion of the child, valence, arousal, and engagement. So we're basically adding those other bits of information only to benefit our task of valence, arousal, and engagement recognition, because then we also better understand gender issues, cultural issues in estimating emotion. Now that gets you to a multimodal and multi-target kind of network topology. And now if you remember what I said about the data correspondences, where you have full parallel or partially parallel or hybrid, you will hardly ever have enough data to train this network with all the different things you want to do. Yeah? So you don't have much data probably with children having facial expression recorded alongside audio, alongside physiology, at the same time having labels for their culture, their age, their gender, and so on and so forth. So you need to train such networks with partially overlapping data, hopefully partially overlapping, and in the worst of cases you can only train individually the visual part, the audio part. You also remember I said it could be a binding modality here, so maybe some of the databases have overlapping modalities. Maybe some of the databases have overlap in target task. And then you also are faced with the problem of shaping such a deep neural network that is very efficient in pre-learning each modality, so you can decide how many hidden layers you have here per modality individually first, before going into a shared hidden layer. And similarly, you could have considerations of how many layers you have individual per target task here at the end, and where to put shared hidden layers. Now what you can do in such a case, where you don't have data for all that you want, all modalities covering all the different outputs that you're interested in, is cross-task or cross-modality self-labeling. So imagine you have a database with a target task A, for example personality recognition. You have one which exclusively holds emotion labels and one which holds likability labels of speech. Then you label this, the trained classifier on personality, the emotion database, to have real emotion labels and computer-generated personality labels. And then you train this database with real personality and real emotion and artificial personality database using this classifier to add likability to the back of labels. You do this iteratively, and iteratively it slowly becomes better because it understands more and more about the mutual dependency of those labels. So in this toy example, using compare challenge data from the industry challenge, with 3 databases, we found an increase for each of the individual tasks here between 2 and 4 to 5-ish percent points. So this idea actually works, and you can work with, even with non-overlapping databases in terms of modality or target task. Of course, ideally there would be some data points with overlap, so if you don't have time to relabel all of the database, you can do some smart relabeling of parts of databases to cover for broadest variability in the label appearance, and that way further improve things. Now, one thing I wanted to particularly mention in this context is also co-learning trust or certainty. Let's think again of emotion. arousal and valence. In emotion, for example, you have labelers, usually some 10, maybe even 50, label the same data point, and then you use some sort of weighted vote or whatever to come up with a gold standard to learn as target usually. So you usually have one target label, but it might come from several labelers. And rather than only using that as a training target, you might consider to include the certainty or uncertainty in such a label as another output task. So you learn to predict uncertainty, but also during learning, you teach the network which data points are more or less reliable. So here we have arousal labeled in audiovisual data from Skype conversations labeled in emotion of speakers from the Audiovisual Emotion Challenge 2018, and you can see that the uncertainty most of the time is low, so the labels will agree on what is the emotion inside, but there's also quite a significant amount of instances in the data set which have a high disagreement. Now, if we add this uncertainty as an output node, that essentially means is that we teach the network to recognize uncertainty. So you can use that as a confidence measure, for example, in multimodal fusion, score level fusion or whatever. And it also teaches the network which data points I said are more or less reliable. So here you have an example of low arousal. So the guy in the picture is lowly aroused at 1% in the data set. Clearly these images are different in terms of arousal, despite the majority vote giving 1%, and you can see the uncertainty difference is 10%, because here the labels were green and here there was an 11% uncertainty across labels. Here it's even more severe, same arousal, but you can see here is smiling much more than here, and the agreement is 20% versus 60%. So training 28% arousal from both of these video frames, of course, is a risk. But if you also give the confidence or uncertainty as an additional information, the network learns to better handle this by co-learning about uncertainty. That's the same for valence as examples. We don't need to look into that. Rather than that, I just wanted to show you the benchmark results from the challenge, give you an improvement in concordance correlation coefficients by 0.1, so rather significant if you co-learn this kind of uncertainty. Now the next problem you often have, or sort of still the same problem, is little data. Little data, in particular in multimodal setting is that because you don't have much data from co-occurrence of audio and video labeled accordingly. It's also often a question what were labelers using, were they actually using the multimodal information or were they using only monomodal information. So if you think of emotion labeling, if you have people label only the speech channel or only the vision channel and people label the multimodal impression, you get totally different labels sometimes. So for that reason, we have to look into ways of coping with little training material. And a great one here is transfer learning, in particular in such multimodal settings, because you can use transfer learning even across modalities, we'll see for that. So who's using transfer learning? Few, okay. So the idea is that you are learning from database A to do the tasks of database B. We are great at it, so if you speak French, you can also understand a lot of Portuguese. I guess if you're in, let's say, Poland, right? Or Czech Republic with Russian, you can understand almost everything, I would assume, right? Not so? Okay. How about Croatia? If you speak Russian, wouldn't you understand a lot? Croatia? No? Ukraine, okay, let's take Ukraine, sorry. So let's take Ukraine, because you speak Russian you would understand a lot. If we as Germans go to Denmark or Holland or something like, of course we don't understand everything, but we can get a lot of the gist of what is being talked about. So that is the idea, to learn from one task to do another one. That can be done on representation, signal, feature or model level. Most of the transfer learning really happens on feature level or model level, and we will see some examples of that. Now here is the first example using an autoencoder, so mapping the input onto itself and training a sparse representation by a hidden layer with sparse neurons to get a compact representation learning. And you can train this on data from the source domain and then map target domain data by running it through this trained autoencoder. So what would that be? We had to recognize autistic children's emotion. Of course, we didn't have data for that, but we had a lot of adult emotional speech. And to make the adult emotional speech more like the children emotional speech, we trained an unsupervised autoencoder. So just having children's speech and training to map the input onto the input was a compression autoencoder, meaning that we have something that cannot learn the mapping by heart, but only learns the representation of the child speech. If then we run adult emotion features through this autoencoder, we make them more like the child emotion features, that's the sort of transfer learning here. And if then we train emotion recognizer on adult to child transferred speech features, we get a clear improvement on recognition of autistic child emotion. So you see, without doing any transfer learning, we have 56%. With learning in the target domain, so labeled children emotional speech, we had 60%, so better than doing nothing, of course, because we had labeled emotional children speech. But if we use this kind of mapping, we get 59%, so close to having labels in the target domain, despite not having target domain labels, but only doing this autoencoder transfer learning. Now, we can do that better. You can do training of an autoencoder in both domains, so train autoencoders on adult data and child data, have a shared hidden layer to learn correspondences between these two domains. And that is how we get 64% here. 64% exceeds the 60% of having target domain labels without having target domain labels. So in other words, we're better by doing the transfer learning with adult speech than even when having few child emotion labeled data points. So in other words, that works well, and there's more fancy algorithms to do that, like universal autoencoders. I won't talk about this, but it's a similar idea and it also gives you similar results. Yesterday somebody asked me about correspondences across audio. Here's an example of learning speech emotion recognition by training with music emotion. So you're basically having a speech-to-speech setting, a music-to-speech, and a music-to-speech with transfer learning. This means that we're only training a model on music emotion and then recognize speech emotion with it. This means that we also do some transfer learning to make it better. And rather than looking at the plots, let's look at these results. Speech-to-speech gives you a concordance correlation coefficient here around 0.75. But if you train on music, we also get 0.54 or 0.55. So of course it falls behind, but it's pretty good in fact. In terms of music seems to be similar in arousal. And then we do transfer learning by some tricks like the ones shown here in the previous slide and get some slight increase for that. Now that's still monomodal, and now I wanted to go cross-modal. In this example where you use image pre-trained networks to recognize audio. So basically, we're looking at the interspeech compare challenge from last year, snore sound recognition. The baseline was to do it with statistical functionals, so mean of pitch and spectral coefficients and so on and so forth, as we learned yesterday. We have some 59% or so here. Then if you do an end-to-end learning with a convolutional network and a recurrent network, you fall behind because you don't have enough data to train that. And now comes the interesting bit. Because you don't have enough data to train the convolutional part of the neural network, why not take a network that has been pre-trained on a lot of data? And the convolutional neural networks out there these days, which have usually been trained in most data, are image networks. So rather than starting with a small database of an hour of snore sounds, we use an image pre-trained convolutional neural network and represent the audio as image. Now representing audio as an image is easy. We've learned it yesterday. We do a time frequency transformation and then have this kind of image here. So again, because it's so bright, it's hard to recognize by eye that these images of 4 different snore types look different. But you can see that this one distinctly looks very different from this one, for example. You can down here recognize better that there's different regions here to look at, which are areas in the spectrogram which are having more energy depending on the snore sound. So the idea is to use the spectrogram and then enter it into an image network like AlexNet, VGG, GoogleNet, ResNet, name it, and then use not the convolutional layers output, but the fully connected network following the convolutional layers. Those are the layers that usually give you the result like bus, cloud, person, and so on and so forth. But rather than taking the last layer, where you're going from very low semantic level to very high semantic level, we're using the previous layers, so the ones before the last layers, so for example fully connected 6 or fully connected 7, to have something which in this spectrum looks for areas, because it uses kernels from lower levels which are edge filters or alike, and puts them together to regions and looks at such concepts in the spectrum. And then when we use this as a feature vector, we can use any kind of classifier at the end to process the information. So this could be a support vector machine, it could also be a neural network, whatever you choose here, but the trick is that we use transfer learning across modalities to use the image representation as features for an audio classifier. This is the part here where you actually train the last classifier with your target domain data, so it's noise sound recognition. This is the part where we use feature transfer learning to use features coming from another modality. Now at the end of the day you get the best result by doing that, still held on this data set today, so no audio-only approach was yet able to outperform this mixed image pre-trained network plus audio classification approach to do this. Now if you're thinking of how to represent the image or the audio as an image, you could of course think, why should I go for short-time Fourier transform? Yesterday we learned wavelet transform would be better in common time frequency resolution, so let's go for some wavelets. So here we're representing the audio as wavelet. That's the same audio here represented by different wavelets, bound wavelet, Morse wavelet, still using the same convolutional layers and so on and so forth from the image part, and we do this not once, but we present the same image network with 3 different representations by different audio to time frequency representation, and therefore get a larger feature vector concatenated at the end to do the classification, and we can get a little bit of improvement by some 4% over using only short-time Fourier transform from doing this on the D-Case 2017 task. What is D-Case? D-Case I mentioned yesterday is an auditory scene analysis challenge where you have to recognize sound events in audio. By the way, why is the spectrogram that we're choosing using this kind of color map, green and blue? That is because image networks are largely trained on nature images, and nature images have a lot of green meadow and blue sky and blue water inside. So after experimenting with all sorts of color maps, we figured that one that has a lot of green and blue inside works best. So that's very sleeves up, hands-on engineering tricks, of course, but at the end of the day, it gives you better results because it better fits what the image network has been trained on. This even works for speech. So snore sounds and decays are sound events, and you would say, what about speech? Speech is a much more complex phenomenon, probably. Here you can see deep spectrum features versus back of audio words or traditional audio features in noisy and clean settings on the emotion challenge 2-class task. And what you can see is that the image network is always at least on par with each of the best. So you have to combine these 3 to get as good as the deep spectrum across clean and noisy settings. In the meanwhile, we ran the 5-class task, and there the image trained network is much better even than the individual networks. So in short, we're very excited at this moment, and not only us, others are using it in speech recognition even, about using image networks for audio tasks. There is a toolkit of ours coming up at GitHub for deep spectrum, and if you're interested in those toolkits, please drop an email and I can also give you some slide set of toolkits of ours and you can have a look. There is a download repository where you can download data and work on these different things, but I think we don't have the time here to go through it. Yeah, the network architecture is still something we're investigating, and we're starting now to train our own networks. This is, for example, a network for echolalia recognition in autistic children. So echolalia is when you repeat things, either of yourself or of the caretaker you're talking to. So we're trying to do an echolalia recognizer. We'll present this at Interspeech, and it's some very strong result here at 80% above to recognize echolalia with neural networks trained on images, despite not having any kind of explicit speech recognition or like. So it's just using directly audio signal matched to images and using long short-term memory networks after some convolutional layers pre-trained on image representations to do this kind of job. So even recognizing similar things repeated to recognize autism, working very nicely. We've also done this for the heartbeats challenge. So this year at Interspeech Compare, we were giving a task to recognize heartbeat abnormalities. So you have to listen to different types of moderate or severe arrhythmicality and problems in the heart, in the phonocardiogram, so sonifying the heartbeat. And again, we were using such an image representation for normal and abnormal cases of heartbeats. Again, using different kinds of wavelets alongside FFT, so Baum, Morse, and Eymour wavelets put together, and now with even more streams. And we also put that together with back of words, so back of audio words, but actually it's some sort of back of visual words, you might say, because it's coming from the audio to video, runs through CNNs, pre-trained on images, and then agglomerated to histograms across different channels from different image representations of the audio. And you can see a huge improvement. The baseline was at 47%, and the learned VGG image network plus a support vector machine based on this kind of topology gives you 10% improvement at 56.2%. Yeah, there's also some sequence-to-sequence learning and another toolkit, but I said I'm more than happy to put together also the presentation with a download link into the set of presentations I've been giving here. Where you can find those toolkits for experimentation, and you can also find OD, which is already on GitHub. Yesterday I was mentioning adversarial networks, and I was showing speech synthesis with adversarial networks. Vision synthesis is a long time covered. Now the next thing you would want to attempt, of course, is generating audiovisual material with one GAN, so coupled modalities during rendering with a GAN, and try to render audiovisual sequences. We're not there yet, we're currently trying this, but what we did now is move the GAN to a recurrent GAN such that we generate sequences, so we're not producing isolated observations like isolated images, but rather we use a long short-term memory recurrent neural network, generative adversarial network topology to produce sequences of material. And we're not using a single GAN, but an ensemble of such recurrent GANs to overcome model collapse. Now, what is model collapse? Model collapse is the urge of GANs to produce two self-similar data. So it's not well covering the space of potential generalized observations, or generated observations, but it's rather doing self-similar things. So in other words, we're not using one GAN, but simply several GANs with recurrency to now start to produce audio-visual observations through time. And if you look at TS&E visualization, so some cluster preserving projection from high-dimensional space to low-dimensional space, you can find better distribution for ensembles of GANs than for single GANs. Here you can see the dotted and non-dotted or filled and non-filled circles here are original observations and generated observations, and the generated observations without an ensemble tend to stay more closely to the original ones, whereas in the ensemble you get a better spread. It's not too easy to see here, but the results we get so far are also leading to that being true. Now another opposite direction is big data. So what if you have a lot of data, but maybe you don't have labels? Maybe it's not true opposite, maybe it's also partially similar, but the idea really is you have a lot of data, maybe even multimodal, but you don't have the labels for that, what to do. Now the first thing in terms of multimodality I wanted to show here is co-learning with different modalities. So in co-learning you usually want to try some sort of certainty coming from a machine estimation about the truth of what the machine assumes. So in other words, you have some data set with labels to train a classifier, and from that trained classifier you classify new data which is unlabeled, and then you want to decide, should I add that to my training back and retrain with the machine labels or not? Usually you try to get different views on the problem. So for example, you could use different classifiers like a recurrent neural network and a support vector machine, and you could postulate things such as only if the recurrent neural network and the support vector machine get the same result, I will use the machine label because it seems to give you a coherence. Now that doesn't seem too certain yet, because you have two different classifiers, whether they're both mistaken, it's still the same modality. So rather than that, you can use different modalities plus potentially different classifiers to gain more views. So what we're currently doing in audiovisual behavior recognition from the internet, from big data, is using audio and video with different representation by RNN and support vector machine, and only in case of agreement, now you could say at least 3 out of 4 or even 4 out of 4, do we use the machine label to retrain the machine with those labels. The point is, in big data you often just don't care about how much data you throw away, it's only a matter of processing speed. Because you have hundreds of millions of YouTube videos out there, you can go through endless amounts of those and only pick the instances where you really think, okay, now I found one where I'm really sure about what I'm doing, but I don't need human labels for that. Now this is a similar thought with the architecture put together by deep learning across several layers with different modalities, and also work in such a deep learning context. And in fact, we just had an article in Signal Processing magazine where we suggested several alternative concurrent solutions to this kind of problem. We've been talking about transfer learning, and now I wanted just to highlight a few more on this side to do weakly supervised learning in case you have a lot of data, but little labels for that. And maybe the most drastic one is this case here, where we have the idea to do a recognizer for a problem that we don't have data for ourselves, but the internet should have it. So let's learn from the internet. Here, for example, a robot learning to recognize laughter while watching video, and each time he recognizes laughter, he moves his arm. So the idea is really we have our computers watch video 24/7. Now, how does this work? We're basically giving one example of what we're interested in, such as laughter, a single video. Of course, it should be one where really laughter is present and not ideally. So you may want to invest a little effort in getting your one single example, but it's only one. And then we do a feed into the social media recommender engine, like YouTube or whatever else you choose, and do a complex network analysis based on the recommendations by local clustering coefficient. And that is also explained, and the toolkit is also available in this extra slide set I'm happy to share. That's CAST toolkit, CAST the database. And basically, you're coupling here, or you're clustering here, recommendations that lead to similar content. So you're just using the recommender engine's recommendations without knowing really what it's based upon, because that is a business secret of social media platforms, so you will not learn what YouTube is exactly doing or what your other social media platform is doing. But it gives you candidate videos clustered. So what we would next want to do is do an unsupervised content verification. So with our single video, we go into a cluster point and see if this cluster is content-wise matching what our example has inside. So in other words, we're having the audio sequence, for example, and see if it's giving you a close distance in the cluster center. If the cluster is close to our observation, we say this is a promising cluster and move more into this direction. So the idea is to come down from millions of videos in YouTube or whatever else. We first do a recommender-based clustering here to boil it down to thousands of potential videos by unsupervised content analysis, identifying promising clusters. Now that's not good enough. From there the error would still be too high, so we're entering it into a crowdsourcing platform here, our crowdsourcing platform, I hear you play. But the big plus of this platform over Amazon Mechanical Turk or likes is that it has a machine intelligence backend. And the machine intelligence backend essentially gives you semi-supervised learning, what I've just been talking about, plus active learning. Active learning is identifying which instances are best to label by humans. So in other words, the machine first sees, am I confident enough that I can label it as machine? If not, because for example you don't have sufficient agreement across modality A, modality B and different classifiers, then let's decide if this data point is interesting enough to bother asking a human. Yeah, because human labeling is cost intensive. Yeah? So how do we determine if it's worth asking a human? There's different ways to do this. One could be this uncertainty co-learning. You remember I just told you co-learning uncertainty. So if you would estimate that this database would have a high disagreement across humans, then it seems to be interesting to ask humans, and not only one but many. If you would predict a low uncertainty for humans, you would ask maybe only one human. So you can decide how many humans should I ask. You can also say, I want to see if the model parameters would change. If I knew what this data point was, would my model parameters change? If not, let's forget about it, not interesting. You can also see if it is novel. Is it very different from what I've seen up to this point? How would you do that? Remember my autoencoder for transfer learning. You can train an autoencoder on your observations so far, run the new example through that autoencoder. If the Euclidean distance between output and input of that autoencoder is large, it would mean that it's rather novel. And then again, it seems to be interesting to ask a human about that. So different ways, estimating novelty, estimating uncertainty, estimating change, expected change in model parameters could inform your active learning. And at the end of the day, we were able to reduce the number of human labels we needed below 5% by active learning, and we were able to reduce it to around 3% by dynamic active learning. Dynamic active learning is when I also include how many humans should I ask. You can even learn whom to ask on what, so whom to ask on what and when. So the ideal combination and sequence of operators you're asking about a problem in very targeted ways to further reduce human labeling involvement. Now what you can do with this is this 3-hour challenge we did. Actually it was a 24-hour challenge, but we had given ourselves several tasks. And I'm picking here examples. Each task had 3 hours time to learn a classifier to recognize something new in audio, which we haven't done before, completely from the internet, in exactly this fashion. So we had 10 students in the lab for 3 hours to help us with the labeling. The computer getting the data, doing cluster analysis from a single example, the starting point, doing this unsupervised content analysis, feeding into the mixed self-learning and human active learning combined cooperative learning platform. And after 3 hours, you can see we had a sneezing recognizer at 85% accuracy, for example. So it could say, bless you, if you're sneezing in front of your computer. But we didn't have sneezing collected. We would have to wait for a long time, I guess, until all our students would be sufficiently sick to collect sneezing data. Similarly, we had a coughing recognizer operating at 97%, thread recognizer at 73%, and so on and so forth. So you see, some of these tasks were very well, even after 3 hours only, but the idea, I think, is pretty powerful. You don't have data yourself, but you just use data that is out there, even if it's unlabeled. Now this is I Hear You, the crowdsourcing platform. It's gamified to make labeling more fun. People can rate, can also rate others, to include some gamification elements, can record also data, speech, video, text, whatever, get opinions on that. So we have people label other people, to have people get opinions from other people, but us getting labeled data. There's also a social component and gamified component by giving different ranks. So if you rank for a long time, you can make your way up from novice to grandmaster labeler, and you can compare against others. So you have the label of the week, of the month, of the year, and you can, for example, give away an iPod or whatever to the label of the month or something alike, and rather than paying by click, we do this more as a competition and as a gamified labeling. Our feeling is that we get much more quality labels by doing that, much higher quality labels, and the best seems to be to organize it in teams, so you have team A versus team B. Team A could be ITMO, team B could be Imperial College. And then you say after a month you train a recognizer on the labels from ITMO and on the labels from Imperial students. Let's see if ITMO can show the Imperial dudes, teach them a lesson labeling. And that seems to work like a charm and getting people much better motivated than paying per click. So this is again the whole idea of having a labeled data bit to train a first model. You have a lot of unlabeled data. With this first model, you classify the unlabeled data, and then you decide, should the machine label it, or should we rather ask a human, or should we just discard it, because we have so many of these data points here that we don't care discarding 10 out of 11. And then we do this iteratively, and here you can see the example of the thread recognizer trained from social media data. After some 100 human labeled data points, we were already at 65% or so, whereas if we had labeled any data point, so we did 10 times picking of random labeled points labeled by humans, we're still around chance level. In other words, it's much more efficient to do semi-supervised active learning than just labeling everything. Yeah, and as I said, at some point this all boils down to speed, because you have 24/7 learning from the internet as a more and more predominant paradigm. Of course, it could be similarly learning from user interaction with the data, with an application which is out there at scale. If you think, for example, of the speech recognizer from Google, it really became very good once they had the speech recognition out there and people gave their interaction back to them. So this made us put deep learning onto GPU. That doesn't sound new at all. We did this actually in 2010 as the first to put the LSTM recurrent neural networks on the GPU in our current library. And at that time had a speed up sometimes of 40 for our tasks. Waiting 1 day or 1.5 months is of course a huge difference, so all the speed is really a very crucial factor in this game. Similarly, we had these different image pre-trained networks, AlexNet and BGG and the like, to get different views from different image pre-trained networks for audio. To video learning distributed these days onto several GPUs, and on each GPU we do this in parallel, getting a good speed up by distributing across several GPUs and doing GPU in general, combined with splitting, leading more and more to a double kind of parallelization, when we have a process parallelization combined with a data parallelization. Really fighting to be fast, to learn from big data, such as from video recognition about audio phenomena, such as learning from audiovisual phenomena by getting human labels combined with machine labels in very efficient ways. Now that leads to the vision of more context integration and knowledge-based integration in our multimodal fusion approaches, because so far we're mainly fusing modality A and B. But we also want to have some symbolic knowledge integration in such processes to have it more powerful in application settings. I didn't recommend books so far, I think. This is one I want to recommend, not the volume 1, but the appearing volume 2, which we just finished. That is a handbook done by Sharon Oviatt and colleagues, but we invited many very prominent authors, and they made a big effort. It's not a collection, it's really a handbook in the sense that they have walkthrough examples, that they have more of a teaching book on mind, and it was a really coordinated effort to do this. The volume 2 is about multimodal, multisensorial deep learning and fusion architectures. So several of the images I had shown today actually come from that handbook. And the second part of it is about, of the volume 2, the second part is about emotion and affect, and cognitive load measurement and the likes as examples of multimodal, multisensorial architectures. So volume 2 is really the one I can recommend in this context, and it's appearing in the next days. So that is 1.5 hours. I'm not sure how strict we are on the schedule today. Should we make a break now? Yeah. And once you're back, we can have a vote on how we proceed with our last time slot. Should we talk more about deep learning, or do you want to talk about statistical machine learning and audio features? Okay. Then back in 15 minutes-ish.
Can I ask a question?
Oh yeah. Sorry, one question.
What's better to use, 2D convolution or 1D convolution for spectrogram?
Sorry.
What's better to use, 2D convolution or 1D convolution for spectrogram?
2D or 1D?
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll talk more about that if you vote for deep learning. There's even the option of using 3D to do a spatial temporal modeling. We're using 1D a lot these days because we want to go from the raw signal, and if you have enough data observation from that, we really like that, and combine it with LSTMs. 3D convolution has the advantage that you really can learn spatial temporal attention mask, for example. Okay, and yeah.
Okay. How can I draw the different modalities? What?
How can I?
Drop modalities.
Oh, drop modalities. We'll talk about dropout learning, but the idea really is that you delete the neurons of that modality during one iteration of learning.
So I just set these features to 0 and that's it. Yeah.
You really delete the neurons and the connections leading to those during that iteration.
What is attention method is just weights under the features, and we just put it under.
Yes, so that we will also see. Basically, you can do things like, for example, max or mean pooling, where you try to compress the information or the size of the maps from previous layers to further layers, and you collect information from several adjacent matrix or map entries by choosing only one to be forwarded. This one could be actually by having an average of those 4, say, values, or it could be a mean, or it could be by learning weights and doing a weighted sum. So that would be your attention correspondence in that case.
Thank you. And these features with attentions was a visualization of these weights, yeah?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Sorry, yeah. That was the visualization of those weights, yes. Okay, then let's be back in 15 minutes.
Очень много, а по полиэффекту, кстати?
Не, ну вот часть, когда можно обработки аудио.
Я слышал, типа?
В смысле? Не, ну почему аудио можно перевести в спектрограмму, в рамках. Это я даже видел в решении. Вот.
Виталий, я бы делал, я бы не задумался. Но он какой может себя? Ну то, что ты делаешь спектрограмму именно в зеленых расцветке, потому что вот эти предыдущие серии,
да.
Они на натуральных картинках, там типа небо.
Да, но это я бы тоже не задумался. Да.
Я уже не задумался. А вон мы ходим.
Ну,
просто чайка. Ну, в смысле, он же на вопрос периодически, когда Друзья, можно, пожалуйста, водить сейчас интервью будет записывать? Если можно, можно выйти. Либо просто очень. Here's all the Susan. Okay. Sure.
Okay, and we'd like to ask you what's your general impression of this?
Yeah, very nice, very dedicated students. I really like their interests. They really want to know. They also make up their mind for asking more questions, which is really nice.
Is it in any way different from such schools that you did when you were at the university elsewhere?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if you can easily find differences, but maybe students are very, well, how to say that, very dedicated, interested, yeah, you really just see them staying with a very active mind, listening to what you say, looking at their own system.
You answered already about the question that they gave you today on yesterday, but what about the answer they gave you yesterday when you answered that question?
Yeah, it was actually quite nice to see that they really followed you and they were giving answers which not only made sense, but beyond that, so clearly showing a big positive and strong interest. So, very nice.
Do you think about machine learning is not machine learning? About machine learning, do you think it's going to be as popular as it's now in the next 5-10 years?
Yeah, of course we're always seeing these patterns of hype and then losing the interest at some point. I've lived as a researcher through at least one research studies already. At this point I think we're seeing such advantages in machine learning happening on broad scale of real-world applications, the ideal student is not going that down as it used to be of the past types, but they much more see it for long periods. Maybe even the biggest interest for long time that the students acquire in this whole field. Simply because they have no opportunities, they don't really offer recognition from governments, going more and more into general intelligence, let's say, and I think that will keep the whole up, maybe even boost it further than we're seeing.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Да?
Я учил.
Ну, ты этим уже не понимаешь, или сам?
Ну, да. Я теперь на ЦРТ. Но сейчас больше.
Хочешь графемом заниматься?
Не, я
Давай.
Alright, so I think we slowly get started on the final part. The final part is about classification algorithms. Actually, I would rather call it learning algorithms because we'll also talk about regression, not only classification. So, as said, we have GMMs, HMMs, and SVMs. We have deep neural networks with RNNs, LSTMs, and CNNs. And I would leave it to you if we should start with deep learning and see how much time is left for statistical learning, or we actually start with statistical learning. So please raise your hand who wants to start with statistical learning. Please raise your hand. Is that already for neural networks or still statistical? Okay, statistically raise your hand. Okay, 5, 6. Who is for neural networks to start with? Okay, closer than I thought, but still twice as many for neural networks. So let's start with those. Let's see that we move quickly and hopefully can do both of them. Just generally, why at all different classifiers? Ever since in the machine learning world I've been part of it, so some 18 years or 20 almost, there has been a super broad variety used. So you have kernel machines, you have trees, you have decision based on distances, you have statistical ones. Why? Of course, first, mostly people are interested in research in the scientific literature and the best performance in terms of whatever, accuracy or correlation coefficient or something like that. But of course, there's many further problems to that. But even if you look at just the performance, here we did a comparison for acoustic novelty detection, including support vector machines, HMMs, GMMs, and many different neural network combinations. And you can see after all quite a difference here in F measure for acoustic novelty detection, so hearing a sound that you have never heard before, like a gunshot in a rural environment, in a calm one. And you can see something between 70 and, what is it at the end, almost 90% going from some GMM or support vector machine to some specific type of neural network. So performance is a driving factor in the literature, but there's many more, such as adequate modeling. For example, do you have a time series or not? Is it dynamic or not? Dynamic is something that is still very well handled by statistical learning because of Viterbi-like algorithms in neural networks. You try to emulate that by a connection central classification, or CTC for short. And many other things like, can you do end-to-end learning? Can you combine symbolic and non-symbolic? For example, in Bayesian networks you can do this very elegantly, also combine learned knowledge with expert knowledge very elegantly. Can you handle missing features, uncertainty? Is it learning stable or not? So does it make a huge difference if you use a different learning set? Therefore, it's best to use ensemble learning or something alike. Learning stability, also along the lines of adaptation with new learning data, and how much will it be impactful. Transparency is a big one these days in upcoming desires. That's a major complaint, for example, against neural networks. People say they're not transparent, and we want to know why they make such decisions. Big discussion. Then, as said, optimal accuracy, some benefiting features that you would want to have if it should have optimal accuracy, such as able to do nonlinear problem solving, of course, ideally discriminative learning, auto-weighting of features, tolerance even in high-dimensional feature spaces, adaptability, allowance for diverse spaces and the likes. But, of course, there's other considerations than accuracy, and those include, for example, efficiency. Can it do real-time, or is it fast? Can it adapt quickly learn from few examples, for example, or does it need a lot of data? Further economic factors like computational cost, energy consumption, and the likes, if you want to do it on mobile devices. And last but not least, also optimal integration plays a role. How well can you embed it in an application context? Does it give you also confidence measures or embed list trees as output or likes? Is it distributable? So many further considerations that justify consideration of many learning algorithms. So here I just divide them basically into static and dynamic, and in static you have so-called lazy learners. First, lazy learners are things that do not train a model, but they just save all the examples and in runtime make a comparison with each example. That could be, for example, Euclidean distance based nearest neighbor. You're storing all your examples and you do a comparison with each example rather than training a model. Stochastic classifiers like Gaussian mixture models, Bayesian networks and the likes do a model based on statistics, and then we have function learners such as support vector machines that are based often on distance, like support vector machines will also be based on distance but train a model. Function also subsumes the neural networks, and then you have, for example, trees and other forms of that. The dynamic classifiers were those that can handle a time series, potentially with dynamics in the time series. You remember our asynchronous multimodal fusion, that was one of those problems. The classic here is dynamic time hopping. That is a lazy learner with dynamic abilities because it stores all examples and compares your new example against those. Of course, you could also do combined model learning with lazy by building some unsupervised clusters to compare not against each example but against each cluster representative. Then we have the dynamic Bayesian networks, which subsumes the hidden Markov models. That has been in vogue heavily in the audio field before neural networks came up again, you might want to say. So over the years I've been working in these fields. It started for me with neural networks and hidden Markov models, and support vector machines came, graphical models came and pushed away everything, and neural networks came again and push away everything at this moment. So you always have these ups and downs, and who knows what is going to be the next one. At the moment, for example, we're seeing deep belief networks trying to combine deep learning and statistical classifiers. So in a way you can say it's always good to keep knowledge over the concurrent approaches, to see what they're better at, to see also how you could combine these with your new ones. I've shown you examples yesterday and today about combining deep learning, for example, with non-negative matrix factorization and exemplar-based learning. I've shown you examples combining deep networks with DTW, so it can often be beneficial to know these other ones. So here's, for example, putting them together in dynamic and static tandems or hybrid learning with such an architecture here, a graphical model, in this case a dynamic Bayesian network, working together with a recurrent deep neural network was our winning architecture of the Chime Challenge for the most noise-robust speech recognizer back in 2012. And 2013, I think. These days we're doing it really mostly deep, not tandem anymore or hybrid anymore. But we've just revisited the example with the GANs, for example, meta-learning, like ensemble learning, when I told you that we're learning an ensemble of GANs to overcome model collapse. So combining or re-instantiating classifiers and ensembles can be quite a promising thing to consider, also in times of deep learning being written all over. And of course you have other kinds of learning-related things such as feature-space reduction like PCA, LDA, and the likes. I don't want to talk about that so much now, but really stay with statistical learning and neural networks. Just to give you a more general overview on machine learning, how much more we could talk about. What is decisive is first the target, and the target impacts your kind of learning algorithm. The classic one you might want to say is classification, where you have these discrete classes and you decide for class A or C or whatever. Regression is the next most classic one probably, where you have a continuum, a dimension, like age prediction, and you're predicting the age from 0 to 100 or whatever as a continuous valued number. Then you have trees, where you even as an output have a tree structure that can be very suited in transparent and explainable learning, where you also show how you came up to this. Uncertain targets, this would be, for example, the case in emotion recognition, where we had this confidence colon, for example, to deal with uncertainty. You could have missing information, that was the dropout learning for multimodal fusion as an example these hours. But you could also have drifting targets. Drifting target means that as you go, your learning target changes and you have to do some sort of permanent transfer learning because the class changes how it appears. It could be, for example, a virus that is changing its appearance or even its functionality, so you have a drifting target. You could have multiple targets, we've seen that in co-learning and many more things. Now the features are decisive. Do you have a time series or a static feature vector? Do you also want to generate features? That could be the case in a variation autoencoder or GAN in what we've been looking at. And then you have to have abilities like feature reduction, selection, and the likes. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to machine learning to optimization. You have a zoo of different optimization algorithms at hand, many bio-inspired, like colony annealing, evolutionary learning, and the like. Many more to choose from. And then you have all these different learning algorithms. Neural networks, kernel machines, trees, graphical models, and. We also have different kinds of learning. We've mostly talked about supervised learning these days, so all the data is labeled. That was including semi-supervised, where you had a labeled data set to start from, but then started to self-label with the learning algorithm. We also talked about active learning, picking instances of particular high informativeness, rather than labeling everything. But transfer learning we've talked about, and there is reinforced learning and many further forms of learning that you could be catering with your learning algorithm. Different forms of embedding considerations, theoretical considerations, like is a support vector machine a neural network? Is a neural network a hidden Markov model? And people doing papers about the similarities across learning algorithms, and finally different applications that require specialized forms of your learning algorithms. So from all of that, we will be mainly talking about neural networks now first, and then see if we can talk about statistical learning with graphical models, mostly in a supervised form. Now, pardon me for skipping to part 2. You'll get a sneak preview of what you're missing, or not missing if you make it in time. Yeah, and here we go. So yesterday I asked you to do neural networks, and I think you all raised your hand. I would still want to do a 10 minutes or so intro to recap what a neural network is. That gives us also the basis of considering what else we could be doing and considering what we haven't done so yet. But if it's too boring again, please raise your hand and say, yeah, time is precious, go on, man. So deep networks and neural networks, of course, aren't particularly new. So you could say it started in the 1940s, where McCulloch and Pitts had their first formal model of a neuron postulated. 1949, we had Hebb think about learning or training of such neural networks. He was still doing it by looking at the connection between two neurons and trying to strengthen this if this connection was heavily active, and weaken it if it wasn't active. So the Hebb rule, already in 1949. We had the first mechanical model by Rosenblatt in 1958, and in the 60s you had Adeline, a least mean square algorithm for neurons. Even the term DeepNet appeared already in the 60s. So in 1965 there was the first mention of DeepNet. At that time, however, it was hardly referring to what we call DeepNet these days. It's basically just the idea to have several layers inside. And in fact, shortly thereafter, still in the 60s, Minsky and Hubbard said multi-layer perceptrons have limitations and there was a certain stagnation. We will also talk about considerations at that time, if it makes sense to have more than 3 layers, so is deep useful at all. Noticeably, even the term convolutional neural networks and the principle appeared very early on. First mentioned in 1979 by Fukushima. Of course, LeCun and others come to mind to talk about convolutional neural networks, but you see, most of these ideas are not new at all. Backpropagation was appearing in the mid-80s, and deep learning, not only DeepNet, appeared for the first time in a paper. Though Hinton, for example, known today as one of the godfathers of deep learning, uses it only in 2006. So a lot was going on in the 80s and even 90s, way before we have this hype now. One particularly important one is 1997 in my eyes, not only because I'm from TUM, where Jürgen Schmidhuber and Sepp Hochreiter invented this, but really because it shapes largely our today's deep learning, and that is the long-short memory networks. Overcoming the vanishing gradient problem and allowing to train recurrent neural network, which, if unfolded over time, could be named very deep neural networks, made to work efficiently. So in 2010-ish, you have Hinton, Ruslan and others come up with other ideas to overcome training deficiencies by introducing stacking, restricted Boltzmann machines and other things to overcome vanishing gradient problem in deep neural networks. We have further tricks appear like rectified linear units, dropout learning and the likes to enforce sparsity and benefit deep learning. But the other huge factor that really made this work is the combination of computational power, like moving to the GPU, even moving these days to specific neural processing units, tensor processing units. So hardware really crafted and made for deep learning. In combination with big data, because deep networks are very efficient at dealing with big data, put together with a lot of open community spirit. So you have arXiv, for example, as a medium to put your paper out immediately, even before peer review. And it has become so accepted that you think a good author will put something on arXiv that's good enough for me, I don't need it to be peer reviewed. So this saves half a year at least, you would say, if it's about journal articles, sometimes 1 year, 2 years in time, because people immediately put their pre-published stuff out there, and it heavily accelerated this field. Together, of course, with open mentality and source, so TensorFlow and other open source libraries, hopefully also our current at some point and others, heavily boosted the pace in this field. And then came a lot of money. So somebody of you yesterday admitted the motivation to get rich. In fact, you can get very rich with this these days. It's unbelievable how people are bought out of academia these days, and how big companies push you as an academic these years. Don't you want to earn 3 times as much? Name it. Or do you really just want to be an academic? And along the same lines, how they push you to produce postdoc and students knowing deep learning and immediately buy them out. If you meet them on the street in London, for example, in my case, they're coming after finding their first job to you like, Professor, we need some money. Because they have these top jobs, let alone in Silicon Valley and the likes. So money, of course, was quite another thing that helped you. This is just a quick what we did in deep learning. We've been pushing deep learning a lot in effective computing and speech and audio processing. We were using it in 2006 already. It was on short memory networks for meeting analysis. In 2008, the first ones to use it in effective computing. With on shorter memories. In 2011 with stacked and restricted Boltzmann machines. Again, the first in 2015 introducing the paper, but a little bit earlier, the first GPU LSTM toolkit. And in 2016, the first to do end-to-end learning and effective speech processing. And 2017, doing this for physiology. In 2018, tri-modal deep learning end-to-end across video, physiology, and speech. So that is in the speech, audio, and effective computing domain, and those were golden days for us. We won a lot of challenges like Chime, like Myrex, it's a music challenge, for example, best onset detector, media eval for different tasks, including music mood, including violence tasks and the like. Simply, not by being particularly smart, but simply by using deep learning. Thrown at different challenge tasks and doing this from challenge to challenge, brains off, deep learning on. Of course, these days it's less low-hanging fruits, but it seems like there's still a lot of low-hanging fruit out there. So now let's just very quickly recap what a neural network is. So it all starts with a neuron. A neuron is a technical approximation of the mammalian neuron in the brain. Of us, of other mammals, and basically you have a weighted summation of the input features, like in a feature vector, and a nonlinear decision function to decide based on the weighted features. What does it give you? It gives you a linear classifier with the normal vector being spanned by the weights here. So those form your normal vector, and the bias here, which is often inserted as a x0, 1, and a weight to be learned for this bias here as the offset of that linear separation hyperplane. So your single neuron will give you your linear classifier. What can you do with that? You can do, for example, logic problems like and or. So logic and with two variables, and you can separate the 1 here in the case of both variables being 1, and you can train that from examples to put a hyperplane in between the green dots and the yellow dots to solve an AND problem. Same for the OR problem, of course, because it's still linearly separable. One linear separation will suffice to do the OR problem. It stops at the XOR problem, because the XOR problem is not solvable with one linear separation hyperplane here. You can't separate yellow from green anymore in this kind of setting. And the real-world problems usually aren't linearly solvable, so rather than that you have a highly non-linear complex problem to solve in pattern recognition tasks in the real world. So what helps you there is this non-linear decision function after the weighted summation. That is usually something which is almost like a unit step to say left of 0, it's giving as an output 0, right of it, it's giving 1, but that doesn't work well because you need something differentiable for learning purposes. And then usually you say it should saturate because then it's biologically plausible. In the mammalian brain, this translates to potential, electric potential, so you can't have infinitely high potential. So you want something soft such that it's differentiable, goes to 0 on the left side, to 1 on the right side, saturates. In short, sigmoid function was prevailing over decades really as the function to use. We will see in a few slides why in deep learning these days we're often also using rectified linear units, which gives you also differentiability because it's 0 on the left-hand side and it's a linear function on the right-hand side, non-zero steepness. Problem here is it's not biologically plausible anymore because it can get infinitely high, so violating this thing that in a mammalian brain you couldn't have infinitely high electrical potential, of course. But we'll see for advantages of this rectified linear unit. And the other thing we're doing is putting together several of these neurons or perceptrons, so to allow for more complex things to be learned. What we get from that at first is the multi-layer perceptron, a directed weighted graph with neurons grouped in hierarchical layers with connection between those layers. And that would look like this, for example. You have groups of neurons in layers. This would be your input layer. It could do nothing, just forward the feature information, or it could normalize these feature values here. Then you feed into next layers with groups of neurons to put this over some processing layers to an output layer, and here you can decide on how to encode your target. If you have 3 classes, for example, you could use one output neuron per output class and encode the information as the one that is the winning class is 1, the other should be 0. Otherwise, you can also use only 2 neurons and say it should be binary encoded. You could even use only 1 neuron and say in ranges of the output value it's resembling different outputs classes. Now let's come back to our XOR problem. Can we solve this now? And yes, we can. If you think of logic, we can translate XOR to ANDs and ORs, X1 and not X2, or not X1 and X2. And if you remember that one perceptron suffices to do AND and OR, we can see that we now need 3 of them grouped hierarchically, because refers to these 2 ANDs here, and then we do this OR here, and the neural network can of course learn the inversion. So with our multi-layer perceptron, we can now solve this kind of problem. So why would we then need deep neural networks? Let's look at what can we do with more and more layers. With 1 layer we have our hyperflat. With 2 layers we can do a convex polygon by having piecewise connected linear separation. With 3 layers you could do any boundary. So this is what my supervisor, my PhD supervisor told me, even my habilitation supervisor told me, you don't need more than 3 layers. That was common opinion in the 80s, 90s, noughties. So you don't even think about it, just 3 layers, that's it. So let's look at it in pictures. 1 layer net is clear. This is what a 2-layer net can do, connected piecewise separation. With 3 layers you can even have areas cut out of that, and that gives you arbitrary separation planes. So, just to think a little bit about the topology before we talk about YD. So far we've seen the feed-forward network topology, which is coming from input in forward direction to output. If you do a matrix, sort of confusion matrix, input, hidden, output, over input, hidden, output, you see that by a feed-forward network like this, we're not using much of the potential connections. The next ones to add would be skip connections, very much in vogue these days in so-called ResNets, residual networks, where you skip over layers. We'll see that as well. And then very important, if not most important, the recurrent neural networks. Recurrent neural networks because we're usually processing something with temporal information. Temporal information meaning it has some history into the past, usually also into the future. Meaning you don't want to make a decision only blindly looking at this moment in time, you want to use what's been going on before. And recurrent neural networks essentially give the output back to the input in some way, and hence they allow to indirectly integrate the last decision into the next decision. You have different types of recurrency. This one is direct feedback, so you're going within the same layer from the output to the input. You can also have, and that gives you the main diagram in this matrix, you can also have recurrency to the previous layer, giving you the mirrored usage here from the feed-forward neural networks. But you can also have lateral feedback, so within the same layer going side by side. That is leading to some sort of winner-takes-it-all paradigm, where within a layer only the strongest neuron gets it all and becomes stronger than the other ones, such as in Hopfield networks. This gives you the lateral feedback here within the layer, gives you mirroring of around the main diagonal. So to sum up, the recurrent neural networks give you lateral within the same layer, indirect across layers, backwards to previous layers, and direct within the same layer recurrencies. And if you put that together, you would get all of that matrix used. If you even include the recurrency, the direct recurrency here, you would also have the main diagonal filled. The Hopfield networks look like that, everything filled. used in the 80s, 90s to restore characters, noisy characters, as a sort of associative memory. You gave a character with the bits, so each neuron here would resemble a bit of a, say, 8 times 8 bitmap, so you have 64 neurons, and by putting some neurons noisy, it would still recover to the unnoisy examples, so it's sort of, yeah, memory task. We don't do this anymore these days. What we really do these days, most of the time, in audio, video, and so on tasks, is simple recurrent neural networks. The simple recurrent neural networks have a context node here that stores the last output and feeds it back in the next step of time. So that is the kind of topology we will be largely using. One to add will be convolutional neural networks, which however are sort of feed-forward neural networks, so we're combining feed-forward and recurrent networks. And the problem, of course, is to train these networks. We don't have time to really talk about training, but in quick, what you're doing is you put the training data with your data and the target label into the network via all those layers, and at the output of the network you compare with the desired output, the de facto output. So here you insert something with a label and you compare at the end, is the label that is coming out of all this weighted summation and nonlinear decision making over layers leading to the desired output. If not, of course you have to change something. What you're changing usually is the weights inside the network, and you have to find efficient ways of changing all those weights despite getting the information only at the output layer. So feeding back the information and that it should be changed through all these layers, and it's a deep network, it could have 100 layers or so, is what is leading to vanishing gradient problems. You're in a gradient descent running out of numbers here, and your gradient becomes close to zero down here. So in short, it's really difficult to propagate the information back through the network if it's deep. Hence, we will have these skip connections during training, the residual networks, and hence we will look into memory integration in the network. We'll see for that. Basically, a lot matters in how you initialize this network. Before you do your first run of iterative adapting weights, you will do this over 50, 100, whatever iterations. It matters a lot how the weights are initialized here. So transfer learning, for example, would give you something to give you better weights initialization than just random weights. So you could run a network to do gender recognition at first in speech because you don't have emotion data in big quantity. Then you have something which has weights which are already adapted to the speech task. And then you run your actual task over that and retrain to emotion recognition. Other things, of course, include the stacking here, which we will see in a few seconds, but the idea really is initialization of weights is one of the magic parts to invest effort into. Now these are the typical errors that you can have. If this is your error, let's consider a single weight for the moment. Of course, you have millions of weights inside the network over all the layers. You can have You always have the aim to reach the global minimum. Of course, you can't do exhaustive search. You can't look at all combinations of the millions of weights. So you have to have efficient search algorithms. You usually change into the direction of the error that you want to change from the output layer, including some step size. And this step size should usually be adjusted, like in turboprop and rprop and other sorts of backpropagation. If you would have a fixed step size to change the weight, weight plus delta weight, you can have these kinds of problems. A would be that you find a local minima, but you don't need it anymore because your step size, say, is too small, and you never get out of this local minimum and think you should terminate your iteration. B is very similar. You're halting due to small gradients, nothing is changing anymore. If your rule would be if the gradient doesn't change anymore for 10 times, that's stop. C would be oscillating in a value, so if you do not adapt your step size during weight adaptation, you could get stuck in such a form here. And D would be skipping near to global local minimum because your step size is too large. So it's all about efficiency in search by changing the weights with some smart control of the step size to change the weights. And as you introduce more and more learning parameters, and in deep neural networks you sometimes have up to more neurons these days than the mammalian brain, even in ours, in some use cases, so we already surpassed the number of neurons in this mammalian brain. You could have massive overfitting, so learning the data by heart. So of course, rather than just trying to optimize the error on the training data, you usually have a held out validation partition, and at some point it will increase, the error will increase on the validation set because you're just learning the data and you're not generalizing anymore, so you're stopping when the error increases for a prolonged time in the validation set. So you have different kinds of learning rules, and usually we're using backpropagation-esque learning rules. That's the supervised learning. It's not biologically plausible because it's not reinforced learning, but supervised learning, and it's based on gradient descent, works well with simple recurrent neural networks, Jordan networks, feed-forward networks, and the likes. Just to keep in mind, there's other learning rules like the Hebbian learning, which I mentioned, strengthening the connection between two neurons if it is often or if it is highly active, and competitive learning, which you have more in Hopfield and the like networks for unsupervised learning, or songs and other things for unsupervised learning. So by that the question arises, what is then deep learning? Why do we need deep learning? Deep learning, what it is a good question, because most papers claim they're doing deep learning, even if they're just using a multi-layer perceptron or an average neural network. Why? Because it's trendy to say you're doing deep learning whenever a new topic arises. Like everybody was claiming to do big data, even though the databases were not really big at that time. Is it about the number of layers? So you should of course have at least more than 3, because 3 is the past. Or is it much more about the methodology you're using to make this work? Like rectified linear units, like stacking of autoencoders, like LSTM and the like. Well, probably it's a mix of those two, but let's say you should have at least have 4 hidden layers, otherwise it's still hardly deep. And just to give you some impression, AlexNet in 2012 had 8 learning layers, so not the input layer, with 60 million parameters. In Inception, V3 also an image classifying network, in 2015 had 47 learning layers with 25 million parameters. So you see a clear change in architecture to cater even less parameters, going much deeper. So the idea is really about the arrangement of the neurons and rather have several layers deep than a broad learning or broad arrangement. The expectation, of course, is to be able to learn highly complex in the sense of highly nonlinear separation functions, to apply to our tasks, and to be able to reuse parts of the network for transfer learning. And the particular strengths of the deep architectures then is that you can use a big amount of training data very efficiently, so the performance for deep architectures would increase much better with big data than flat architectures when I want to exploit the big training data. So essentially it's about the number of free learning parameters to allow for even more complex decision boundaries to be established. But deep learning in particular is the form of arranging this number of free parameters in a particular type of architecture, namely rather using several layers than a few broad layers. We'll see for even more motivation why to do that, because you can do a lot of targeted function imposition for those layers by arranging them smartly. Now I wanted to go through this zoo of deep learning enabling mechanisms and start with long short memory. That's a little bit a long timeline also. I said it's 95, 97-ish when Hochreiter and Schmidhuber came up with that. The vanishing gradient was a limiting factor to recurrent neural networks in the 1980s, because I said if you unfold the network over time, you have a deep neural network. Backpropagation through time was invented to be able to train those networks, but they were not as efficient as they should be because of the vanishing gradient. So the problem to communicate or propagate the error measure that the last output back through all those layers to the early layers. So a rule of thumb in the 1990s RNNs was that you have forget a time of 10 steps in time, as you're not storing the information from the past processing in the network, you're just implicitly giving it back by giving the output to the input. The vanishing the information is vanished after 10 steps in time. So something that happened 11 steps earlier in time does have absolutely no impact on the current decision, and in fact it's a negative exponential decaying function. So the influence of former events hardly impacts on later events if time really becomes larger. So that's the short memory effect, and Schmidhuber, by introducing LSTM, did not mean that he's introducing something with a long and an extra short-term memory, like the human brain is often described. Rather, he wanted to say a longer short-term memory, or a long short-term memory. So it's a prolonged short-term memory because it can store the information for longer than those 10 steps in time. And in fact, it can even learn how to weight information in previous time steps. So just like we're weighting which input features to use, how much with LSTM, we're weighting also past observations, which impact should they have on future decisions. The vanishing gradient was also tried to overcome by other things, such as history compression or stacking. Stacking meaning that you have the input feature vectors of 10 time frames put together to a super feature vector 10 times as large, all of which wasn't particularly efficient. So the real breakthrough was really this idea of long short-term memory. Now how does it work? We want to memorize information, so we have our perceptron just as before, but we introduce a memory cell. The memory cell here, the cyclic error cell, is simply having an auto weight of 1, hence storing the information inside the cell. Now we need something to control when to write into the memory, when to read from the memory. For that, Schmidhuber gave away another neuron here that controls the gate, and this gate is a multiplicative open or shutdown gate. In other words, this gate is having also some threshold decision function here, and if the value gets very high, it triggers to 1, or if it's very low, it triggers to 0, and hence opens or shuts down the memory by weighting the output of the perceptron times 0, therefore multiplicative, or times 1, and likewise forwarding it into the input of the memory or not. Same for the output. The output here is deciding when to use this information in next perceptrons. Schmidhuber also introduced peephole connections to trigger input and output not only from the outside, but have the memory also have a say when it wants to be written to and read from. So far you just have an architectural layout trick introducing these multiplicative gates here and further neurons, and it's very easy to do this kind of topology. In the next iteration, they discovered that they need a forget gate to erase the memory. It wasn't enough to just have an input gate. You explicitly needed to erase the info by setting the auto weight of 1 here to 0 at some moment in time, so just another neuron. What does it give you? It gives you 3 more neurons for 1 neuron, meaning 4 times the parameter number. And if you want to be more conservative about enhancing the parameter number, you can have input, output, and forget control not one perceptron, but a whole layer, say, for example, or a whole set of perceptrons, so you then hardly increase the parameter space. Now this is the same put into equation, not too interesting. I think the idea should be clear, and here is how we integrate it into a recurrent neural network. So we have our input and output layers, and we can decide in which layers do we want to introduce LSTM cells, potentially or usually also with forget gates these days. Just to mention it already at this moment in time, in the meanwhile the gated recurrent units appeared, and the major thing is to sort of get rid of the idea of learning when to output it and rather exposing the information from the cell at all times. So it's a bit of a simplification, saving parameters and oftentimes being more fast in training because you have less things to train. So let's recap. We usually have time series in speech and video and so on and so forth, and we want to model them efficiently. Hence we have an information stream with potential context in time and potential dynamics. The dynamics we're not catering for yet because this would be CTC, but we're doing a good job in handling context because as opposed to the traditional recurrent neural network where the impact of a past time step on future time steps is vanishing over time, we're now able to store past information by learning when to input into the memory, keep it over time, and deciding when to output it and when to forget it and erase it again. Sorry, erase it again. So we're really learning weighted profiles like this one. At this moment in time, we have a weighted influence of last time steps, per time step a different weight. If we allow for a bidirectional architecture that also operates into future direction, we can do the same for future operations and really weight at each moment in time how much other ones are impacting. Now these are the gated recurrent units. As said, sort of in simple words put, being easier on when to learn, when to output the information, and having fewer parameters, which these times provide a serious alternative to LSTM, but of course still being used in current neural networks as a neuron type. Now coming back to feed-forward networks, Hinton introduced and others introduced a further set of methodologies to make learning of feed-forward networks more efficient. And the first most important was restricted Boltzmann machines, or later on stacked autoencoders, which heavily pushed aside RBNs because they were similarly effective and often easier to implement and understand. So let's now limit ourselves to stacked autoencoders. And the idea is again that we want to initialize these layers, not randomly but more meaningfully than that. And we do it by training an autoencoder, or the layer, one layer of the network as an autoencoder. So we input the features from our training data into the first layer only, and train it to produce the same values as we input into the autoencoder. Hence the name autoencoder, because it encodes the same information as is put inside. Once we've done this and trained this, we have a compact representation of our database and not random weights in this first layer. And we do the same thing for the second layer. So the output of the first layer is then used as input for the second layer, again pre-trained as autoencoder. And we stack these autoencoder by putting them all together layer by layer after sequential autoencoder pre-trained to one network, and then we do some final passes of learning as usual with a network that is initialized not just randomly, but having seen data from your domain, so much better initialized. So the next thing is to consider that will be rectified in the units in dropout learning, but let's just mention that we can also combine, of course, the ideas of recurrent neural network and stacking layers. So this would be a deep recurrent neural network in the sense that you have not one layer, but several layers, recurrent layers stacked above each other. So you're pre-training a recurrent neural network as a autoencoder with recurrency and stack those layers above each other, just as in the feed-forward network stacking. And then if you unfold it over time, so the different time steps, t, t-1, so on and so forth, you have a deep network depending on the length of your observation. So now it's all about, if you remember, this generalization ability about regularization, and you want to limit the number of free learning parameters to as few as we need to avoid overfitting. And now we've been talking about dropout with these different modalities already, so at some point leaving one modality out and not always training with 5 modalities. The same would happen Friday night, yeah, tonight maybe, for some of you. If you go to some bar, you drink, you kill some of your neurons, and your other neurons around become less dependent on those killed neurons. So we're randomly selecting over iteration steps some neurons to be dropped out, to have a higher robustness of those learned parameters, because the units cannot rely on the presence of the neighbors. And that looks like this. We have a neural network, and for example, by random selection, we delete some of the neurons within one iteration step, and in the next one it could be others here, and so on and so forth. In the modality drop, we had parts of the network here resemble different modalities, if you remember, audio, video, whatever, and they had, in a targeted and controlled way, left out neurons that belong to some modality rather than randomly selecting neurons here. Now there's different approaches to do this. It's not too important. You can either just reduce the weights or you can kill them entirely. And different ways to select these, as you can imagine, but the important thing is that you kill some of them in one or the other way around and hence find more robust features. Now, dropout can be used for all the different types of neural networks we are usually considering: feed-forward, convolutional, and recurrent. And the second thing to enforce regularization activation is activation function choice. We've already looked into the sigmoid function as a decision function, which is not a unit step, but which is soft and hence differentiable. So it's biologically plausible, leads to powerful nets, saturates quickly, but it has a little bit of a problem also with the saturation, because for values larger than 5 in our plot here, we always get the same value. So the changes above 5 do not change the result anymore, and that worsens the vanishing gradient problem. So because we limit the activation, the derivative for anything above 5 is almost 0, and the information in the vanishing gradient backpropagation through the network is almost lost. So we want to have better activation functions that are still nonlinear, differentiable, but now non-saturating to avoid vanishing gradient, but still have a fast calculation of the function and the derivative. And the answer found by the community was the rectified linear unit, which I already introduced. So the neurons with this rectified function are called the rectified linear units, so not the function actually has rarely the name, but neurons with that function. And now if you look at what happens, you have a sort of regularization, because anything left of 0 is put to 0. So anything left of 0 here is set to 0. Now what happens here with your neuron activations, you have a lot of zeros here, and hence enforce regularization of this unit. And at the same time, you can get higher values still impact during gradient descent. So the resulting nets are less powerful and more neurons might be needed as a downgrade of reuse. If the activation is too often, little is learned because the gradient is 0. So you do some normalization of the activation function to avoid that. You have the values too much become 0. You try to normalize it around the 0 and not in its original distribution. But you can do much faster learning and also do learning of very deep neural networks. So in sum, that outweighs these two disadvantages, that you might need more neurons and that you might need to do some normalization. They have little in common with neurons, you would say, because you do supervised learning with infinitely high potential, so that's not really as much in the mammalian brain anymore as you would wish it to be, but it works, so what do we care, planes fly, despite not flapping with their wings. So, I mentioned already residuum learning, another trick to overcome problems if the networks become deep, because the information loss at the start of each training layer is impacted by random initialization. Each layer adds further noise to the network, so if you do random initialization, and the later layers can only start to learn once earlier layers start to produce reasonable output, so you have to train for very long, because you first have to have the layers close to where you propagate the array back become reasonable before it gradually becomes more and more reasonable, let's say, in the deeper layers. So what can you do? You can introduce shortcuts to skip, and these are very conservative in this plot here because you're just skipping one layer, but in fact they could be skipping several layers during training to train the network not only backwards from the output layer, but at some iterations also pretend that there were some skip connections to start earlier on learning reasonable things and layers further away from it. So now comes the more applied favorite part of mine, and that is end-to-end learning. End-to-end learning, as we said the other day, is very powerful in just introducing a signal with a label and it learns it all. And that starts, if you remember, usually in pattern recognition with pre-processing. Pre-processing I've shown to you yesterday was non-negative matrix factorization, but you could choose a zillion of other expert-crafted algorithms that were crafted over the years. Here's how you can do it with a deep neural network. You can use an autoencoder, a deep autoencoder, and use noisy speech, for example, as input. So you add noise, additive noise, convolutional noise to speech, and as a learning target, use your clean speech for such an autoencoder. Strictly speaking, it's not an autoencoder because you're not training to encode the input information, but you're using a kind of autoencoder topology to train with a non-noisified thing. Here are some audio examples of noisy first, then traditional non-negative matrix factorization and other traditional approaches to denoising, and then comes a deep bidirectional long short memory autoencoder. I hope you could hear the click sounds of the typing. Here is minimum statistics. All click sounds from typing are still there more or less because it's a non-stationary event, and such signal processing driven enhancing algorithms really have problems with that. Here is sparse MMF. Unsupervised enhancements, still having problems with click sounds. Exemplar-based MMF, that's injecting data. I would argue it's better than any of the before because you're already injecting data, but it's still bad. And here comes the deep BLSDM autoencoder. And I would argue this sounds almost perfect, so really the click sounds are all gone. Why? Because it has the memory and it can overcome these non-stationary events. Sorry. So the next part after pre-processing is feature representation. Yesterday we were talking about MFCCs and the likes, but why not have the network self-learn features? A baby in the mother's body does not know about pitch or energy or anything, but it can learn to recognize the mother's voice versus the father's voice. So the idea is to train it all from data, and in image processing, convolutional neural networks appeared, providing something that extracts features with something that can be trained from data, so the features themselves can be trained by having convolutional neural networks moved over image regions. So essentially what you're doing is, in image processing, you're having some convolutional neural network type kernel here, learned from data, moved over the image. So at each position in the image, you apply this kernel to calculate some feature value, if you will, simply by added multiplication. So not matrix multiplication, even simpler than that, just multiplication of element with element and adding it up at the end. So this gives you the feature value, and this kernel here has to be or can be trained from data. The trick in convolutional neural networks is that you reuse the same kind of kernel over the whole image. You're not only having one of those, but you're reusing it, and hence keep the number of parameters more. So what you're using to learn this is simply some sort of neural network, mini neural network. The kernel has neural weights, and the neural weights can be learned from the data, and then you're reapplying this kernel over the different regions of your signal of interest, and you can learn, for example, in 2D such weights from image processing that we present a 45-degree edge filter in different colors to find different types of edges and so on and so forth. But usually do this hierarchically, and to do it hierarchically you usually need pooling. Pooling reduces the size of the feature maps, and the most classic one is max pooling, where you have one neuron and the max pooling layer forward, the maximum activation of several previous previous activations in forward direction. So here you have your map, and you have only forward the one that is most active in max pooling. Alternatives are mean pooling, where you build the average over those four to not neglect less active ones, and the most fancy one probably is attention-based pooling, where you have the convolutional layer with an attention matrix, potentially translated into something like probabilities, to weight, essentially do a weighted sum here, not just a mean with equal weights, but you learn weights for each of these points to forward it to the next layer. So this could be, for example, looking like this: attention weights for audio type classification, like in a D-case challenge or submission for airport, bus, metro, and so on and so forth, produce different attention weights where we should look at, or how we should weight these depending on the class. The second thing, as I mentioned, is normalization, to ensure that it's rectified in the units, for example. We have good normalization, and you usually do this in batches, so you don't do normalization over all the training data, but you do it in batches of, say, for example, 50 instances. So every 50 instances, you would do normalization for better learning rates and reduce overfitting. Usually only in forward networks, and you, for example, just do such a mean and variance batch normalization of the activation minus mean and normalize to the variance. So if you put that together, you're doing an image processing, for example, over different layers of convolution, where you apply these kernels to extract features, and from the maps of results you do max pooling to reduce information further down to smaller and smaller feature maps, and you have batch normalization in between, depending on your architecture, and at the end you can do some learning, like in normal learning. So this part, this convolutional layers, is for feature extraction, and the learning part here could be a feed-forward neural network, could be a recurrent neural network, and image networks like the one I've been mentioning before in the last talk. You will have classes here like firework, building, what is it, alphabets, people, car, dog, and so on and so forth. And that was where we used the previous layers here as feature representation on images to do audio classification based on that. There's other types of feature and representation learning, like for example, variable lengths, observations mapped to scalar or static feature vectors by encoder-decoder architectures. Here, for example, raw audio based on spectrograms with an autoencoder training with a recurrent neural network. This is a sequence of spectrograms, so windowing and spectrogram extraction, sequence of arbitrary lengths, but we only use the encoder final state into a fully connected network and then into a decoder network to give us a representation and unsupervised, so no labels needed to do network. Sorry, sequence representation learning. And the third part, after pre-processing and feature learning, of course, is recognition again. And here I said we're mostly using recurrent neural networks, but put together into backward direction for past information and forward layers for future information. Now the end-to-end learning we did 2 years ago for the first time, I said, for emotional recognition and speech from raw signal. So here was raw speech signal inputted into 2 convolutional layers, one operating at 5 milliseconds, one at 500 milliseconds. So we're reducing the information over time down to the next convolutional layer by coding pooling, and then introduce into a long short-term memory recurrent neural network for decision making with the ability to learn time profiles, as said. And in the AVIC 2016 challenge task, we were shocked by the performance because we just wanted to be as good, hopefully, as the usual approach. With the huge advantage that we don't have to extract features ourselves anymore, but in fact we were twice as good as the usual features. We then tried to optimize this into a single architecture, combining convolutional operations and sequential operations into this kind of architectures. There were others doing similar CRNN, CLSTM, and whatnot approaches, but at the end of the day it's often simply more convenient, even though this is slightly better to keep it like this because it's more modular. Just to mention, you don't need to necessarily have a RNN at the end. Jerbo Kim and others showed how you can do this with 3D convolutional networks, learning spatial temporal dependencies in a purely convolutional neural network. Of course, it has some certain disadvantages, such as dynamics. So you would want to have something like CTC for 3D CNNs to compensate for dynamics. But Kim showed that they're quite powerful as well. So in theory, you can also consider doing it all with CNN only. Now here is what it learns. The convolutional part, sorry, first the LSTM part learns these time profiles are set per neuron, so sort of per feature type. It has its individual learning time profile and per class. The convolutional part here, if you correlate the activations of the neurons with traditional features like the ones we've shown yesterday, We find very high correlation for most of those, around 0.7, 0.8 even, saying that in other words, the network self-learned to represent energy or loudness or zero and the likes. Now, if you compare the performance on different tasks of end-to-end learning and traditional features, we find mixed results in the sense of code task from the last year compare challenge gave 7% for traditional functions, similar results for back of audio words, but end-to-end learning fell behind at 60%. Why? Because again, similar to small sound, it's just too small a database to learn all the parameters or the features itself from the data. If you did, however, system based on different representations combined, it gains a little bit, showing that end-to-end features seem to be complementary to traditional features, even if you have only little data available. On the AVIC task, we were having enough data to train competitive end-to-end learning, as I said, and there's been a little bit of a race over the last 2 years showing that signal processing-based features can be as competitive as end-to-end learning. So the 2016 double as good as the baseline end-to-end learning features could be further improved by some tricks, reconstruction error inclusion and prediction-based inclusion, but then traditional back of audio words and back of contextual audio words, so audio words over audio words, based on traditional features could overtake that. In between here you see, by the way, a generative adversarial network, which improved further the end-to-end learning. So adversarial learning helps even on speech in emotion recognition tasks. But in recent days we were able to outperform, at least for arousal, again the traditional features with a new topology for end-to-end learning. And valence we're not there yet, so you see it's still an ongoing race, but it also raises the question, how end-to-end is end-to-end if it all depends on the topology of the network? Is it really end-to-end, or do we still need to know a lot about the problem to know the topology? We'll see a little bit about automatic machine learning in a few slides to self-shape the topology. In between, I just wanted to show some more layers you could introduce into a deep neural network to give functionality. We've been talking about signal enhancement with an autoencoder. You can do the same on feature level. So why not enhance the features with an autoencoder? You have signal, feature extraction features. These could be coming from a noisy signal, hence the features would also be noisy. And rather than enhancing with an autoencoder here, let's enhance here and have an autoencoder trained on mapping features extracted from a noisy signal to features trained or extracted from a clean signal. So we're learning to map from noisy features to clean features. This was part of our giant challenge winning contributions front end. So we've been using a simple autoencoder to do the same thing on feature level as well, not only on signal level. We could show that MFCCs after enhancement had higher correlation with MFCCs extracted from clean speech. So it helps already on the signal level or the feature level, it really gives you better features. And it also helped clearly on the task. So introducing a feature enhancement level made the final result better in the case of noisy speech. Maybe I want to skip this in the interest of time, and this we've talked about. You can also do some language modeling with LSTM RNNs. Here we're using LSTMs as a sort of generative approach, just like you would use in Markov models in a generative setting, meaning that we train one LSTM per class and we see which LSTM is more likely to produce the observed sequence, and then decide for the class of that LSTM. So you're mapping essentially a sequence of words onto the sequence of words within LSTM. And you try to predict the missing words in a bidirectional topology, but in order to make this work, you're skipping one word at a time. So in other words, we're producing an LSTM which is trained to predict one word from all the remaining words in a sentence at a time. So in other words, we have a sentence of 5 words, we leave out one word after the other, and each time see how good are we at predicting the missing word. And then at the end, we know the overall generation probability of that class's LSTMs to produce a currently observed sequence of words. We used this, for example, in sentiment classification and got the best result also over other deep learning approaches on the Twitter corpus with such a generative LSTM approach. But that is by far not the only way how you can do it. There's 1,000 variants of autoencoders for text out there, which I will not go into detail here. In particular, CNNs have recently also been used for text processing. So in short, you can use it not only for signal information, you can also use it for symbolic information. And at the end of the day, put it together into some sort of seamless holistic learning, where you have different layers of the network work together. First for signal enhancement, you remember my autoencoder with some short memory recurrent neural networks. For feature extraction, the convolutional layers with pooling in between layers. Feature enhancement, the same as the signal enhancement, known down on feature level. You can also do some feature transfer learning, feature alignment. I've shown to you the deep alignment. We can do some feature selection by simply introducing bottlenecks in the network, meaning layers with fewer neurons to enforce feature selection. And we do some classification and regression, and we can even put some language model on top, like the one you've just seen, like you would have in a typical speech recognizer. So what that gives you is something in one neural network, which is sort of pre-trained layer by layer, or layers by layers, with a certain functionality, such as enhance the signal, extract features, enhance the features, reduce the features, and do the final decision making. So it's not only pre-trained layer by layer in a blind, unsupervised way, but it's much more in a controlled way. And at the end of the day, you can train over all this composition of layers and repeated iterations in an interplay. Now that's of course a huge advantage over traditional pattern recognition, where you have expert-crafted algorithms for signal enhancement, feature extraction, and feature enhancement, and so on and so forth, totally blind to what's going on in the rest of the chain of processing. So rather than having a blind putting together of boxes for one purpose, we have something that can be trained commonly to best interplay with each other. Now this is what I would like to call horizontal holism, because we're holistically seamlessly learning across the different processing steps. And we usually put that together with the vertical holism. That's the multi-target learning, putting together different tasks, even if not all are of interest, and putting aside confidences per task to include certainty in the network. So that is a lot of design of a network, and as I said, the question is now, can we self-shape these networks? Shouldn't the network be able to decide from the data itself how it should look like? That's the direction of automatic machine learning, or AutoML for short, and there's other names to this field, but I like this one, and I think it's a surviving one at the moment. Google is using it, for example, and they're also doing a lot of efforts here. And one study I wanted to show to you, which we're showing at Interspeech in next month, is using a controller network to shape a child network to be better at the Interspeech 2018 crying challenge, that is recognizing different types of infant crying. And we allow the controller network to shape our cry network by choosing the cell activation tool layer, so LSTM or not LSTM, GRU or not, and deciding how many parameters you invest in this idea of memory in a recurrent neural network. So you could have a choice between sigmoid, rectified linear unit, LSTM, or whatever you want here. And we're deciding on the cell number per layer. What we're not deciding yet is the number of layers. That's the obvious next step, but it's the first start into shaping the network by deciding should we have more or less neurons per layer, and which cell type, cell activation type should we have. Does it work? It does. And you can see here on the client task the different things of learning we compared against the sequence-to-sequence learning, end-to-end learning. That's also a baseline of the challenge. Back of audio words is another baseline of the challenge. They are 62 to 67%. Sorry. But our evolved GRU, RNN, so gate recurrent unit recurrent neural network, gave you 70%, so above any of the competitors. And if you look at this plot here, you can see the unlimited accuracy for evolving learning on a similar related task always being above random selection of topologies over several picks and over all IFS architectures. So in short, even though it is rather simple at this moment, only picking activation type and neuron number per layer, it's giving you improved results. And the idea, of course, is that you invest more computation time because you're optimizing on a higher level. But on the other hand side, you save expert knowledge, human involvement, because you have the network self-shape. And in future, we would envision this to be an ongoing self-shaping process, because if you remember from our YouTube data learning, we get more and more data in, and that means I can allow for more and more parameters in such a network. And as I get more data, reconsider the architecture of my network. If you also remember this architecture which I had shown you with multimodal input and multi-target output, you can shape the network in very many ways, like how many independent layers per modality per target task, how many shared layers, where should they be, where should I have bottlenecks, and so on and so forth. So you could have at some point a much more complex shaping of networks than this toy example we're doing here. And the idea, of course, is then again, just throw multimodal data and target tasks at it, and it not only learns the actual decision making and representation learning, but it also learns how to best do that by shaping itself. 17 minutes left. I'm not sure if we should continue with neural networks or try to quickly talk about statistics. Very quick vote. Should we use 17 minutes for statistics? Raise your hand. Okay, should we go on with neural network? Raise your hand. That's close, but let's go into statistics then. Let's try to be quick about this. So to start with, who knows native Bayes? Okay, most. Who knows Gaussian mixture models? Oh, not so much, okay. So the idea, maybe just quickly, is that we want to use statistics to learn class membership based on probabilities, and we're starting with maximum a posteriori probability, where we learn the probability of a class membership given or depending on the observation. We're choosing the class which maximizes this for m, so where m is the class index. So basically, that's our starting point, but the problem is that we cannot easily determine this probability here from data. What you're using therefore is Bayes' theorem, and Bayes' theorem is saying that the joint probability of the class and the observation adheres to this. So the class given the observation times the prior probability, so a priori how likely is it that this class will be present, equals this much easier computable probability, the appearance of this observation given the class times the prior probability of the class rather than of the feature vector. You usually use this to substitute this probability, which you cannot determine easily from data, by reshaping Bayes' rule and substituting this by this kind of expression here, where you have the determinable conditional probability here of the observation and the condition of the class, and the prior probability now added of both the class and the feature vector observation. In maximization, you don't care about the prior probability of the feature vector to occur, because it simply occurred and you want to know now which class it is, so you're usually deleting this, and you're just using prior information of the class and of the conditional probability of the feature vector to occur under the condition of this class, giving you this new rule for the determination or statistical determination of the class, which is optimal if you would have those probabilities, but the bottleneck is that you don't easily have those probabilities. So how do you obtain these probabilities? It's easy for a prior probability. For example, if you want to know if it's going to rain or the sun is shining in St. Petersburg, you simply count over 10 days how many times did it rain, how many times does the sun shine, then you have your prior probabilities. Of course, that's not a good estimate because you only use 10 days. So the problem you can see is having enough data to get the real distributions. It's more tricky, of course, for this one here. It's a conditional probability, and we need to count the feature observations, how many they occurred for each class. And we're usually doing this by two kinds of ways. One is that we bin or quantize continuum here, for example, of the feature vectors, and count the frequency of occurrence for classes. The other one is that we use something parametric because we want to estimate these probability density functions from few observations already, and doing a binned quantization here takes a lot of data to learn it. So in that case we assume, for example, something like a normal distribution, and from few data points only estimate the mean and the standard deviation or variance of this Gaussian distribution as parameters. In reality, of course, these are high-dimensional feature vectors or feature spaces, and we estimate a mean vector and a covariance matrix and not one-dimensional variance. So leading to something in multi-dimensional space, which looks much more like this. Of course, it's still multi-dimensional in terms of high-dimensional, but it's getting the idea. So the most common one is to use Gaussian PDF, Gaussian probability density function. So we're assuming that your conditional probability of the feature vector, the condition of the class is a normal distribution. So hence we have the normal distribution function here, and we need to estimate basically the mean vector and the covariance matrix from the data. So we just need to determine some parameters, and rather than trying to find the whole PDF in reality. If you have the Gaussian function of the normal distribution assumed, you usually use the logarithm of the decision function to substitute the multiplication, the exponentiation by multiplication and the multiplication by addition, so that makes it easier to compute. So you're using log of the normal function, and hence here added log probabilities, and the term here in the normal function is a constant and can be neglected because we're only maximizing. We're not interested in the absolute value, but only in the relative differences. So this is the kind of decision function we're looking at. And if you look at the feature vector, it appears here in quadratic form. This is from the exponential being substituted by product. And hence, the decision function that your Bayesian classifier with a normal distribution assumed gives you is quadratic decision function. If you remember the perceptron had, it was a single perceptron linear decision function. The Bayesian classifier with a normal distribution assumed gives you a quadratic class order. So that's more powerful than linear, but of course not too powerful. And what can you do to make it more powerful? You can use mixtures of Gaussians, so you can assume that it's not a single Gaussian, but it is several Gaussians added. So you're having a weight for each Gaussian, and you have a weighted sum of Gaussian functions here to have your normal distribution enriched by more powerful decision boundaries. Of course, the weights have to sum up to 1 to fulfill probabilistic conditions, side conditions, and what it looks like is like this. So you have the mean vector and then a deviation of covariance in a multidimensional case of added Gaussians, and so you're not only assuming a single Gaussian, but you can then, as you can imagine, match much more complex probability density functions. So in short, to recap here, rather than trying with many observations by a discretized feature space in bins to find with a lot of data these distributions, we assume parametric functions. Just using the normal function is often good enough, so we use mixtures by weighted added Gaussians, but still have fewer parameters to estimate per Gaussian, of course, one covariance matrix, one mean vector, and on top of that, the mixture weight. Now, naive Bayes is simply assuming statistical independence of features, and hence turns this into a much simplified computation of a probability density function, a univariate or multivariate probability density function per feature dimension, and multiplies these conditional probabilities over all feature dimensions. In other words, we're just doing indeed such a 2D plot per feature. We assume independence of the features and then just multiply the probability of all those features we have in the feature vector. So it's much, much easier to estimate those univariate probability density functions than it would be in the multivariate case. That is naive because, of course, these are usually highly interdependent. Think of energy and pitch and capsular coefficients and so on and so forth. Each of those would be highly dependent, but often enough, so shockingly often enough, it's good enough to just use the naive Bayes despite violating this independency assumption and using it in such a naive way. Now let's skip over SVMs because that's really overdoing time and rather go to warping and HMMs. So let's start with the dynamic time warping because some of you said you didn't know it. Now let's assume you have a sequence classification. So rather than having a single feature vector, you have feature vectors over time as a time series. And now you want to model the membership of the sequence to a class rather than a single vector. You could do some feature stacking, but then you can't compensate for dynamics. The example was sunshine versus sunshine, and you want to map, despite the different dynamics in your training sample and the current observation, that this is the same word. So feature stacking does not do the job. You have to do something to compensate for dynamics. Before going into the Markov models, let us look into how this was done first. The very first attempt was dynamic interpolation. That was trying to find from each time series the same numbers of points to map them. And you did this by finding a certain change in signal. So you were finding along each of the two to be compared, let's say 9 points by a similar change of signal value. And this didn't work well, let's make it short. So that was the first better approach than just stacking, but it didn't really work much better. So the next one was dynamic time warping, and we were talking about 70s here, if not 60s. But it's the basis for the oncoming ideas even in CTC today. And again, we want to map a time series of a test pattern of several feature vectors to a reference feature